The Innkeeper by Life Sketcher. Chapter 241 war. Have we met? Lex asked, completely oblivious to her angry-looking expression, mostly because she looked like a cute little doll. You seem familiar, but I don't know many people here. You sat next to me at the mess hall. And now you've done it again. The entire hall is empty, why do you have to sit next to me? I like my personal space. Suddenly, Lex recalled the embarrassing encounter and couldn't help but laugh. He took a look around the hall and, indeed, there were many empty chairs. My bad, I've been really out of it, so I've kinda just been running on autopilot, Lex explained as he got up and moved to a different chair. But, while he was no longer sitting right next to the familiar girl, he was still close to her. My name is Lex, by the way, he introduced himself, but the girl just made a humph sound and looked away, dramatically flipping her hair as she did. Despite his stressed mood, Lex chuckled. To be honest, he really wasn't in the mood to be chasing girls. But, on the other hand, socializing a bit might be good for him. It wouldn't help anyone if he burnt out due to stress. A short while later, their professor entered the room. He was an old man, with a massive bald spot on his head, crowned by streaks of white hair. He was a thin man, almost frail-looking, but walked with the vigor of youth. Welcome to the Basic History of the Crystal Realm. Despite the title, we do not study history too far back, and our course begins 100 years prior to the Craven War. As most of you know, most of the basic level subjects focus on things related to the Craven, for they have dominated the trend of the realm these past few centuries. If you want to advance your knowledge beyond the region of influence of the Craven, you will need to take the more advanced courses. Our lesson begins on the day of the coronation of King Cornelius II, after his father passed away on the battlefield. Back then, he was still a boy at the tender young age of 16. The Hum nation did not exist back then, and the territory that composed it. Contrary to Lex's expectations, he actually enjoyed the history class a lot. The focus of class was not specific dates, or remembering numerous people, but rather a few key people who influenced monumental events. For example, neither the heritage nor any significant life events of King Cornelius II were discussed before his crowning, because it was only after he became a king that he became relevant to the history of the realm. Back then, the Hum nation consisted of hundreds of smaller countries, of course, smaller only being a relative term. From Lex's understanding, some of the smaller countries here were bigger than continents back on Earth. Cornelius, who inherited a country at war, led the most successful campaign conducted by a human, and expanded his country by so much over the next century, no one dared to challenge his reign. When the Craven War started, approximately 300 years ago, humans were not originally involved. There were two races whose territories neighbored the humans, namely the Sentinels and Varns. The Craven came from somewhere far away, beyond the scope of understanding of the humans, and waged war with whoever they could reach. Roughly 80 years after the humans heard of the Varns being at war, the Cravens finally took enough to be exposed to human territories as well. No one expected that they would involve the humans in the war, for that should be to their disadvantage, but they did. Not only did they wage war, they came with a fury that wiped countries from existence in a matter of days. Realizing the seriousness of the matter, Cornelius convinced the humans to band together to face this threat, and paid a great deal to even request the Sentinels' help. Finally, the humans were able to hold off the assault. But hold off did not mean reclaim, as slowly and steadily the human forces were worn out, and once again started to lose land. That was when, under the leadership of Cornelius, the Hum nation was founded. For the first time in history, faced with the threat of extinction, humans put away their petty grievances and joined together to face the threat. As for those who resisted, Cornelius gathered them up and used them and their entire families as the first line of defense against the Craven. But even so, slowly and steadily, they continued to lose land. It came to the point where the border to the Sentinels was exposed, and they too became involved in the war, not for profit from the humans, but to defend their own lands. While humans had been on the losing end of the war, guided by one concentrated effort, human technology and civilization underwent a time of rapid expansion. Their cultivation techniques improved. Their weapons became deadlier, their warriors fiercer, their resolve stronger. That's when grave news came from the Varn. The Poliads, the first race to encounter the Craven, had been completely defeated, and the remnants of their race escaped wherever they could. They joined the other nations in their war efforts, for though they had lost their home, the race was not dead. They fought for the hope that one day, they would succeed. All of this happened in the first 150 years of war, and there was another 150 years or so to cover when the class ended. Their professor told them that he would first give them a general overview of the history of the relevant time periods before they delved more deeply into significant events. The class ended, and the students started to disperse, but Lex remained seated. All the other students had some knowledge of the war. Only he was just learning of it for the first time. This war, whether he wanted it or not, was very significant to his immediate future, for unless he found a way to return to the inn, this was his war too. Chapter 242 Crystal Race. The girl who had been irritated with Lex saw the pensive look on his face and made another humph sound. Why are you pretending like this is the first time you're hearing of this? Even toddlers know this history, she said, for some reason feeling annoyed at him. My spirit was injured in an encounter with a craven while escaping from Bristol, so my memories are messed up. Lex gave the excuse that had become his standard explanation for everything the past few days without really thinking of it. His mind was currently occupied wondering how he was supposed to investigate the origin of the craven. His absent-minded words, however, shook the girl. In her mind, she suddenly connected his odd and absent behavior to damage to his spirit, and suddenly felt guilty for being so aggressive with him. I heard about Bristol, I'm sorry for your loss, she said, her voice suddenly soft and caring. It's fine, Lex said, not sure how else to reply. He literally knew nothing about Bristol or the events that took place there, so it was best to avoid talking about it. I have to head to my next class, it's geography. I wouldn't want to miss out, he said as he got up. Oh, I'm taking geography too. Do you know the way? Nope, but I'm sure we can figure it out between the two of us. The girl, Amelia, was very talkative once she became familiar with Lex. Or maybe she was just compensating due to guilt for her attitude earlier. Either way, Lex found her company enjoyable as they found their way to their next class. Lex was looking forward to geography since he wanted to learn more about active volcanic regions, or really any place that seemed like it would have abundant spirit energy. Unfortunately, the class was just as dry as history was enjoyable. He learned about city placements, settlement patterns, defensible locations, and so on and so forth. Nothing in the class seemed useful to Lex's predicament. Worst of all was the fact that Lex could not even slack off out of fear that he would end up missing what he was actually awaiting. Yet, in their first class at least, Lex discovered nothing useful to him. After geography, he and Amelia split, as his next class was politics, plain and simple. There were 7 major races in the Crystal Realm, and each of those 7 were mostly and conveniently within their own regions. Of course, there were some from each race that traveled far and wide for various purposes, but as far as nations were concerned, these were only stragglers. As a whole, humans mostly only had relations with sentinels and varns. Throughout history, there have both been periods of war and peace between the humans and these two races, but most of the time, they minded their own business. This was because, when matters came to conflict between races, internal conflict would always be suppressed. Two constant potential threats had a way of ensuring that even when humans warred amongst themselves, they never weakened themselves too far. The Varn were a reptilian race and could assume 2 forms, their ordinary form and combat form. While their combat form never lasted too long, making them unsuited for long combat, their strength was disastrously strong. Furthermore, the Varn all shared a strong affinity for earth and minerals, and so fighting them on the ground was usually akin to suicide. Unexpected to Lex, the humans and Varn shared a long history of cooperation and friendship, mostly because there was hardly ever a conflict of interest. The things humans found valuable, especially for cultivation, were usually poisonous to the Varn, and vice versa. The Sentinels, instead, who were a humanoid species, often had conflicts with humans. The Sentinels were a unique, spirit-based species, meaning their bodies were their greatest weaknesses. As it would happen, the resources they required to strengthen their bodies were also strongly suited for cultivation amongst the humans. There was no need to discuss deeper reasons or divisions. All discrimination originated from a conflict of interest. While the two races sometimes traded or even worked together, they also often waged war for resources wherever they shared a border. Of course, this was mostly old news now. Since the Craven War, everyone was desperate for any kind of victory, which had resulted in unprecedented cooperation between the races. Before the professor went to discuss more recent relations, he took a pause to take note of a particular race, the Crystal Race. They were the true hegemons of this realm, and far surpassed all the other races. In fact, it was a popular opinion that if they took this war seriously, the Crystal Race alone could end the war. Yet, for reasons unknown, they settled for defending their lands and not interfering beyond their borders. The reason the professor made a special note of this race was not to inform the students about them, for who truly didn't know of the Crystal Race? No, it was to let the students know never to blame them, or accuse them of ignorance or arrogance for not protecting the other races from Craven. He ensured that each student knew that should anyone be caught cursing or insulting the Crystal Race, the lightest punishment was life imprisonment. This drew Lex's curiosity. Such a strong punishment should not have been warranted for a race so far away, especially one uninterested in the affairs of the world outside their own borders. But Lex had a broader view of things than most people. He knew full well that, once a cultivator reached a certain level, even talking about them could draw their attention. That actually reminded Lex of Balaam, Loretta's father. He wondered if that being would still be able to tell if Lex was thinking about him from a realm away. Just as quickly as the thought occurred to him, he put the thought behind him, for he didn't believe that Balaam would. In this instance, as in so many others, Lex was wrong. Balaam, who had been searching the fringes of the universe for whatever attracted the innkeeper's attention, felt a pull from beyond the veil of the origin realm. That caused him to pause. That was strange, as the attraction he felt was from another realm. Yet the only realms he had ever visited were Garvitz, the realm from which the devils originated, and the origin realm where he currently was. Why would he feel an attraction from yet another realm? Suddenly, something occurred to him, and he used the golden key. A few minutes later, he returned from the Midnight Inn to his original location. It seemed his suspicions were true. The innkeeper had gone to another realm. This complicated things, as the innkeeper's origins became even more mysterious. But wasn't that for the best? Life would be too boring without a little mystery. Chapter 243 Rumors. While Lex was in his politics class, learning the basics of the relations between the Hum Nation and the others, Amelia was sitting with her usual group of friends. "You'll never guess who I ran into," she said excitedly, before sharing Lex's story. In this day and age, where everything in their society revolved around fighting the Craven, the greatest celebrity was one who had fought a Craven. Did he really face a Craven though? "Maybe he's just lying to get your attention," said miscellaneous friend A. "No, this makes sense," said another one of her friends excitedly. "You said his name is Lex, right? I heard a story about a survivor from Bristol named Lex. It wasn't just a Craven he faced. I heard it was the flesh of an immortal. I heard he fought it off with his bare hands to save his fellow survivors." Unbeknownst to Lex, rumors of his unwitting endeavor had already started to spread amongst the student body, growing more wild and wonderful with each retelling. Whether it was by design or coincidence, the stars in Amelia's eyes and jealousy in others were a clear indicator that his story had taken on a life of its own. As for whether there would be any consequences for this, Lex would soon find out. After his politics class, Lex had some free time before his first basic combat class. He did nothing special during that time and just reviewed the information he had learned today in case there was anything important he missed. Once it was time for class, he went over expecting to arrive at a gymnasium full of people, since this was the one mandatory class amongst all professions, but the reality was quite contrary. He arrived in a small room with only 9 other students as well as the trainer, who were all waiting for him, despite the fact that he was early. He expected the trainer would motivate them to learn to the best of their abilities, but his expectations were once again superseded. "This class is the basics of the basics, and it serves only one purpose," the trainer said with the utmost seriousness. "That should you be in a life or death situation, you kill at least one Craven before you die. As humans, killing at least one Craven is your most basic responsibility to your nation, and to your race." The trainer did not look like he was kidding, and in fact looked a little disgusted with these students who could only fulfill the most basic requirements. "I understand that not everyone is a soldier, and the Hum Nation also needs more than just soldiers. We need farmers, we need scientists, we need teachers, we need accountants, we need all the cogs and gear in the machine that is this nation. And that is exactly who this class is for. You will not be burdened with more difficult techniques, you will not be burdened with relentless practice, you will not be burdened with elaborate attacks. In your life, as the lawyers and gardeners and anything else that does not require a soldier's training, should you come into a situation where you need to fight for your life against a Craven, it is best to consider your life already forfeit. All you need to focus on is taking down the enemy with you. And, if somehow you manage to take down 2 Craven instead of just 1, then consider your nation proud of your achievements." Lex was shocked by how brutal and direct the trainer was in diminishing the value of their lives, but none of the other students were. In fact, many of them were nodding along. In moments like this, it would have helped Lex if he had actually investigated the motto of the academy and learned about the meaning behind it. But that would come later. For now, the trainer continued, "Of course, if you feel motivated to do more, to learn more, to be more, after completing this mandatory course, you can take more advanced combat classes. They do not focus on damage for sacrifice and instead train actual warriors who may have a chance of fighting longer and harder. But the rest of you should just hone your skills here." Once the trainer was done with the pep talk, he immediately began the class. Each student received a personal trainer, with the main trainer supervising. As soon as the training began, Lex realized 2 things. First, the thing their training was focused on was trading injuries and doing the maximum amount of damage in any exchange. For this, each trainer took special care in teaching them how to identify weak spots in the enemy's defense. They began, of course, with human targets because that was the body each student was most familiar with, and once the students showed some mastery of the skill, they would move on to Craven, and even the other races. The second thing Lex realized was this kind of combat was actually strongly suited for Lex. Obviously, at his current stage, it was not so evident. But later on, when his defense would be much stronger than the enemies he would most likely face, trading blows, when he was likely to not take any injuries, was a fast and easy way of winning fights. Naturally, he would need to be better trained not only in combat but also judging the strength of his enemies before he could employ such tactics. But it was a good plan, for now. After a long and arduous class where Lex learned as much theoretical knowledge as he practiced, it was time for his most unusually named class, strategic planning. Did people normally perform non-strategic planning? Or did they normally make foolish plans on purpose? It was almost as if whoever named the class was doing some sort of mass naming of classes, and releasing them on the go, which caused this oversight. A sort of mass release, if you will. But, even besides the name, this class had many oddities. There were only 2 other students in this class. Furthermore, usually Lex was the oldest or at least one of the oldest in his other classes, but this time he seemed to be within his own age group. Lastly, the 2 students seemed to be wary of him. This was strange as Lex was sure he'd never met them, nor had he done anything too outrageous that he should develop some kind of reputation. Just as he was about to greet the other students and inquire if anything was wrong, the professor stepped in. "Welcome, students," said the professor as she looked them over, a mature lady with a no-nonsense look on her face. "I am Professor Adelaide, and I will conduct your classes for this subject regardless of whichever level you take, so it is best if you get familiar with my way of doing things as soon as possible. This is not a class that is available to everyone, and if you have been selected for this class, you have displayed some sort of level-headedness under dire circumstances. This class is, and will be, the most important class you will take." You may be wondering why I say that. It's because while every other class you take may be creating a foundation for your future, how you perform in this class will determine whether you live to see that future or not. After all, if you fail this class, that means you're dead. Adelaide paused for a moment for her 3 students to absorb what she said before she continued. "Unlike your other classes, this one will have a field test and the end of the course. The test will be different for each one of you, since you have different designations, and I will pass to you the details of that field test today, so you may already begin preparing. What will be the same for all of you, however, is that each test will contain some element of danger. If you are not able to overcome it, then that likely means you will die. In other courses, if you fail, you can get a second chance by applying again. In this course, the only second chance you will get is the one you create for yourself." Before getting into specific details about her course, however, she looked directly at Lex and said, "Lex, the legendary survivor of Bristol that fought off an immortal with your teeth, I've heard a lot about you already. If half the rumors I've heard are true, then I look forward to seeing your performance." Lex, who was staring at the professor with a dropped jaw, was unable to respond. Fought off an immortal with his teeth? What the hell? Suddenly, he realized something, and looked at his class fellows, and their wary looks suddenly made sense. What were these rumors his professor was speaking about? How had they spread so fast so far? Before he had a chance to ask, the professor began their class. Chapter 244A Rudimentary System. The course for the strategic planning class was a lot more abstract than his other classes, at least in the beginning. Instead of teaching him concrete topics, the class focused rather on the way of thinking. How to evaluate situations, how to juggle objectives, how to prioritize and so much more. He was given theoretical problems similar to the famous trolley problem, only in this case, instead of people's lives, he usually had to compromise on his objectives. The professor told them that, after some theoretical practice, they would go through some drills to practice decision-making under duress. When the class ended, Adelaide, the professor, handed each student a folder with the details of their field test in it. Since Lex's designation was a combat zone consultant, his field test put him in the same position. A month from now, there would be an expedition led by some students to some uninhabited lands within the territory of Hum Nation. The group would be a mix of students of various designations, and the group would similarly have a mix of objectives. The group had to not only explore these new lands, they had to scout for potential valuable resources, mark down areas suitable for new settlements, and finally establish a forward camp for future explorations. These were just the publicly stated objectives, for there was always the possibility of hidden objectives as well. Lex would not only serve as the communication channel between the combatant students or soldiers and the leader of the expedition, Lex would have to advise the leader in matters of security and combat. As for what the territory they were exploring held, what kind of dangers could he expect, and what he needed to watch out for were all things he would have to research on his own. Conducting research and being adequately prepared were also parts of being such a consultant, so the quality of his preparation depended solely on him. Lex felt a headache developing. From having too much time on his hands, he went directly to feeling like he was overworked. Next, it was time for his arrays class. For once, the class was as he expected, and the study of arrays was very similar to what he read in the book given to him by John. But similar did not mean the same. The A. Chapter 245 1 month. Suffice to say, Lex's first month in the academy was extremely busy. Between his various classes, doing his own research for the impending field test, and cultivating when able, he barely had any free time. That limited free time that he had was often spent in the company of Amelia and a few of her friends. Truth be told, she was as helpful, if not more, in bridging the gap between Lex's knowledge and common sense in the crystal realm than many of his classes. For example, the device that looked like a watch he was wearing today was called PT, Personal Terminal, which, for all intents and purposes, was like a mobile phone but with more features, given to him by Amelia. He was also better able to get accustomed to the day/night cycle here, as well as understand how the calendar in the crystal realm worked. Each day was 25 hours long, with 5 days in a week and 6 weeks in a month. Since Solite did not have a fixed pattern, the plants, the people and the civilizations had adjusted to it accordingly. Not all, but many of the plants as well as insects were luminescent, and many animals had developed extra senses to accommodate for the long periods of time without light. The humans here, in general, had much better eyesight than Lex, as well as a small degree of night vision. But for academy students, that wasn't an issue, as apparently the academy had its own dedicated soul birds. Apparently, the dean had a flock of them as pets, so at least in the academy it was never dark. Other than that, Amelia also helped him get accustomed to the social norms. As his geography class proceeded, and he began to understand how vast the area controlled by humans really was, he truly began to wonder why everyone suffered from such a sense of crisis when after hundreds of years of war, the Craven had barely taken over 1% of their land. The answer, once again, was Cornelius too. As a far-sighted man, as well as one of the strongest, if not the strongest, human, he understood the threat of the Craven early on. After that, well, it was merely a matter of might being right. He forcibly converged all the strength and resources of the humans, created the Hum Nation, and organized a unified effort to defend against the Craven. Time had proved him right, as only with such a strong and dedicated approach were the humans able to prevent the Craven from completely destroying them the way they had done to the Poliids. Eventually, human society became accustomed to such a ruthless style of existence, mostly because they had no other option. This was because King Cornelius too had a personal motto which, as dean of the academy, he implemented here as well. The motto was simply, I don't give a shit. You don't want to fight? No one cared. You don't like the style of government? No one cared. You think the world is round instead of a flat, endless mass of land? No one cared. The only way to get people to care was to first fulfill your minimum responsibility to the war efforts, one way or another. Then your opinion became relevant, to a degree. Slowly, and steadily, that motto as well as the singular mentality of doing everything to defeat the Craven had seeped into the minds and habits of everyone. So long as you cooperated with the system, it was fine, but the moment you stopped cooperating, well, Lex finally understood why no one cared at all about the village that had been destroyed during his assessment. He suddenly realized how dangerous his rant to Vernan about not joining special forces had been. Even the generally compassionate and understanding Amelia showed no reaction when he mentioned the destroyed village to her, nor did her friends. It chilled Lex at how normal death was here. During this time, he also focused on managing the inn when he could. Surprisingly, the husband and wife duo still had not finished their test to join the inn. But, in a way, it made sense. Since they were the strongest to join to date, they had the toughest test. The one issue he was unable to solve was getting access to more worlds for the incoming expo hosted by Earth. There were some options he could use if push came to shove, but those would be last-minute options. Furthermore, he would also need to use some accumulated energy by the system to access the more advanced features. He had also given his all to his part-time job, even if he could not understand the forging methods his boss employed. With all that on his plate, despite Lex managing to deal with his stress, he had an increasing urge to smoke. Unfortunately, smoking did not seem to be a common practice here, and without anything to smoke, Lex could only make do. That did trigger an old habit of his, of playing with something in his fingers. Since he had no cigarettes, nor pens to play with, without realizing it, Lex had begun to play around with the inn's golden key in his fingers. He was passing it from finger to finger, twisting and turning it around his hand, while not really paying any attention to it. That is, until one day, it occurred to him to try to use the key to go back to the inn. Unfortunately, since this realm had not been anchored to the inn, the teleportation didn't work. Furthermore, as the innkeeper, the system restricted him from using the key himself. Chapter 246 Departure. The expedition party had 120 students, each a part of a subgroup that had a certain purpose. Only 30 of the students had combat-related designations, with the remaining having their own reasons for joining the group, from prospectors, to cartographers, to wilderness explorers and more. Despite their various fields, Lex was still the person with the lowest cultivation level here. Although he had made sure to spend time cultivating, and the rich spiritual energy of this world helped speed up his growth, he had still only reached Chi training level 5. But, as a consultant and advisor, he would not be on the front lines should they encounter any danger. Well, that was what was technically supposed to happen, but once Lex reported to the leader of the expedition, and confirmed his role, his grimace let Lex know exactly what the man thought of him. Ptolemy Woodman, the leader of this expedition, had worked ridiculously hard to have this expedition organized. This was not a mission from the Academy for him, this was something he had to convince the Academy to let him do. He proved himself time and time again, and did endless research and preparation to show the Academy that this expedition would be profitable. Not only that, he had to sign a contract, stating that should the expedition end up a failure, he would work for 10 years for the Academy to make up for it. Yet, in the end, they stuck him with some consultant to help him advise on security measures. He was not an amateur who had never seen combat. He had gained experience doing time on both the front lines during such expeditions and in the command center during army drills. This was an insult. But, as someone who understood the rules, he knew throwing a tantrum was pointless. If this is what it took to lead his own expedition, he would tolerate it. For now. We're leaving in 3 days, Ptolemy said, handing Lex a list. In this time, become familiar with the roles of everyone in the expedition. Also, if you have any requests in terms of gear or personal equipment, turn it in by today. Since the Academy is funding the expedition, there is a certain allowance for equipment needed for it. Lex was surprised by the fact that he could request gear, as he had spent most of his personal earnings during the past month to purchase all sorts of stuff for this expedition. If he could request more for free? Well, as a New Yorker, it went against his personal code of conduct to refuse free things. The most expensive things he needed were ingredients for a special kind of ink he could use to form arrays even in the Chi training realm, so he did not hesitate to request as many of those as he could. Ptolemy was confused by the request, but didn't care enough to inquire about their uses. Over the next 3 days, Lex spent all his time getting acquainted with the students on the expedition. This is where the skills he had picked up at the inn shone the most. Lex had become charismatic enough to strike up a conversation with anyone he met, and make a favorable impression when he left. Of course, this was not what he was normally like, but in this instance where he was trying to get to know everyone, and build a positive relationship so that the expedition wouldn't be affected, he could turn on the charm like a switch. In fact, internally, even he was a little surprised by how easy it was. The contrast between how easily he had ingratiated himself to the members of the expedition, and how much of a loner he had been for the past month was drastic. It seemed sometimes, making an effort was the only difference between 2 entirely different outcomes. That, and the fact that no one had yet connected Lex to the rumors about him that had spread. Though, that did not mean he regretted having a small social circle. His focus was on making the best use of his time at the Academy, not making friends. Only a small part of him admitted that his time during this past month would have been absolutely miserable if it hadn't been for Amelia's company. Finally, on the day of departure, Lex stood alongside the 120 other members, his backpack filled to the brim, and a small duffel bag on the ground beside him. Of everyone, he had the least luggage, mostly because he skipped out on bringing many spare clothes and focused only on the essentials, a decision he would soon come to regret. They did not have to wait for long, as soon Ptolemy arrived alongside some school staff. They would have no chaperones during their excursion, and would have to rely on themselves, but for them to reach their destination, they would require the Academy's help. It need not be said that the Crystal Realm was massive. The equivalent of 1,000,000 Earths would not even cover the amount of land held by just the Cravens, let alone the other races. This explained why so much land was left unexplored, even in established counties. They followed them to the teleportation terminal, one of the most important and most well-supervised regions of the Academy. Trying to move around Hum Nation on a vehicle would take exceedingly long times, which is why teleportation was such an important feature. Teleporting a few individuals around, like it had been done to Lex during his assessment, was relatively easy. But to move 120 students far off, all at once, would require them to use the teleportation formation. Lex, to me, Ptolemy said commandingly, summoning Lex to his side. Lex did not like his tone or demeanor, but he listened nonetheless. From here, we'll be teleporting directly to Karam City, the nearest settlement to our excursion zone. From there, we will head out, and it will take us a few days to reach the boundary of the explored lands. Since you're here on an advisory role regarding security, do you have any suggestions? Lex had already done plenty of research on where they would be heading, so he was not surprised by the mention of the city or their route. He was, however, surprised that Ptolemy asked for his advice. The outskirts of Karam City's domain is a dense forest, which we will have to travel through unless you have planned some kind of air transport. Moving on foot will be exhausting and difficult, considering the difficult terrain, so I recommend we rent some Delame lizards as mounts. Furthermore, it'll be difficult to set up camp in a forest, so before we enter, we should send scouts ahead to check any for areas suitable or defensible. Considering the fact that we don't know what we'll be facing as we proceed, it's a good idea to always be as rested as possible. For now, that's all I have. Delame lizards were a six-legged species of lizards that were as long as alligators and as large as bulls. Despite their aggressive nature, they were commonly used as mounts in Hum Nation as they had mastered the art of subduing them. Admittedly, a forest was not the kind of terrain where they could show their advantage, it was better than nothing. Also, despite being somewhat tame, they could also serve as good guard lizards for when they set camp or rested. Lex had already noted down this suggestion while he was doing research, along with a few other things. Unfortunately, since the place they were going to was unexplored, there were only so many things Lex could prepare in advance. Any other advice he had to give would have to be as things developed. Luckily, he had his fancy monocle to help him out in case they encountered something they didn't know about, so he wasn't too worried. Ptolemy did not comment on whether he was satisfied with Lex's advice, nor did he let show what he really thought. He simply accepted what Lex said, but showed no indication of whether he planned on listening to Lex. Going through the procedure to teleport so many people took a couple of hours, but it was still nothing compared to TSA. Brace yourself, a student advised Lex as they walked into the formation. Lex thought he knew what to expect, but the moment the teleportation formation activated, he knew he was wrong. His previous teleportations had hit him with a whiplash, but this time Lex felt like a sledgehammer smashed into his chest. Barely managing to keep himself from falling over, Lex managed to prevent embarrassing himself as soon as the expedition started. But he was not prepared for the chill that hit him next. He looked around and found himself in a small chamber, along with all the other students who were quickly putting on some sweaters and gloves. A moment later, he identified the sounds of an unabating gale. He looked out the window and saw what seemed like dunes of snow, and a snowstorm that threatened to freeze Lex to his very core. What was this? His research never said anything about snow. A moment later, he realized he hadn't packed anything thicker than a t-shirt. The expedition party had 120 students, each a part of a subgroup that had a certain purpose. Only 30 of the students had combat-related designations, with the remaining having their own reasons for joining the group, from prospectors, to cartographers, to wilderness explorers and more. Despite their various fields, Lex was still the person with the lowest cultivation level here. Although he had made sure to spend time cultivating, and the rich spiritual energy of this world helped speed up his growth, he had still only reached Chi training level 5. But, as a consultant and advisor, he would not be on the front lines should they encounter any danger. Well, that was what was technically supposed to happen, but once Lex reported to the leader of the expedition, and confirmed his role, his grimace let Lex know exactly what the man thought of him. Ptolemy Woodman, the leader of this expedition, had worked ridiculously hard to have this expedition organized. This was not a mission from the Academy for him, this was something he had to convince the Academy to let him do. He proved himself time and time again, and did endless research and preparation to show the Academy that this expedition would be profitable. Not only that, he had to sign a contract, stating that should the expedition end up a failure, he would work for 10 years for the Academy to make up for it. Yet, in the end, they stuck him with some consultant to help him advise on security measures. He was not an amateur who had never seen combat. He had gained experience doing time on both the front lines during such expeditions and in the command center during army drills. This was an insult. But, as someone who understood the rules, he knew throwing a tantrum was pointless. If this is what it took to lead his own expedition, he would tolerate it. For now. We're leaving in 3 days, Ptolemy said, handing Lex a list. In this time, become familiar with the roles of everyone in the expedition. Also, if you have any requests in terms of gear or personal equipment, turn it in by today. Since the Academy is funding the expedition, there is a certain allowance for equipment needed for it. Lex was surprised by the fact that he could request gear, as he had spent most of his personal earnings during the past month to purchase all sorts of stuff for this expedition. If he could request more for free? Well, as a New Yorker, it went against his personal code of conduct to refuse free things. The most expensive things he needed were ingredients for a special kind of ink he could use to form arrays even in the chi training realm, so he did not hesitate to request as many of those as he could. Ptolemy was confused by the request, but didn't care enough to inquire about their uses. Over the next 3 days, Lex spent all his time getting acquainted with the students on the expedition. This is where the skills he had picked up at the inn shone the most. Lex had become charismatic enough to strike up a conversation with anyone he met, and make a favorable impression when he left. Of course, this was not what he was normally like, but in this instance where he was trying to get to know everyone, and build a positive relationship so that the expedition wouldn't be affected, he could turn on the charm like a switch. In fact, internally, even he was a little surprised by how easy it was. The contrast between how easily he had ingratiated himself to the members of the expedition, and how much of a loner he had been for the past month was drastic. It seemed sometimes, making an effort was the only difference between two entirely different outcomes. That, and the fact that no one had yet connected Lex to the rumors about him that had spread. Though, that did not mean he regretted having a small social circle. His focus was on making the best use of his time at the academy, not making friends. Only a small part of him admitted that his time during this past month would have been absolutely miserable if it hadn't been for Amelia's company. Finally, on the day of departure, Lex stood alongside the 120 other members, his backpack filled to the brim, and a small duffel bag on the ground beside him. Of everyone, he had the least luggage, mostly because he skipped out on bringing many spare clothes and focused only on the essentials, a decision he would soon come to regret. They did not have to wait for long, as soon Ptolemy arrived alongside some school staff. They would have no chaperones during their excursion, and would have to rely on themselves, but for them to reach their destination, they would require the Academy's help. It need not be said that the Crystal Realm was massive. The equivalent of 1,000,000 Earths would not even cover the amount of land held by just the Cravens, let alone the other races. This explained why so much land was left unexplored, even in established counties. They followed them to the teleportation terminal, one of the most important and most well-supervised regions of the Academy. Trying to move around Hum Nation on a vehicle would take exceedingly long times, which is why teleportation was such an important feature. Teleporting a few individuals around, like it had been done to Lex during his assessment, was relatively easy. But to move 120 students far off, all at once, would require them to use the teleportation formation. Lex, to me, Ptolemy said commandingly, summoning Lex to his side. Lex did not like his tone or demeanor, but he listened nonetheless. From here, we'll be teleporting directly to Karam City, the nearest settlement to our excursion zone. From there, we will head out, and it will take us a few days to reach the boundary of the explored lands. Since you're here on an advisory role regarding security, do you have any suggestions? Lex had already done plenty of research on where they would be heading, so he was not surprised by the mention of the city or their route. He was, however, surprised that Ptolemy asked for his advice. The outskirts of Karam City's domain is a dense forest, which we will have to travel through unless you have planned some kind of air transport. Moving on foot will be exhausting and difficult, considering the difficult terrain, so I recommend we rent some Delame lizards as mounts. Furthermore, it'll be difficult to set up camp in a forest, so before we enter, we should send scouts ahead to check any for areas suitable or defensible. Considering the fact that we don't know what we'll be facing as we proceed, it's a good idea to always be as rested as possible. For now, that's all I have. Delame lizards were a 6-legged species of lizards that were as long as alligators and as large as bulls. Despite their aggressive nature, they were commonly used as mounts in Hum Nation as they had mastered the art of subduing them. Admittedly, a forest was not the kind of terrain where they could show their advantage, it was better than nothing. Also, despite being somewhat tame, they could also serve as good guard lizards for when they set camp or rested. Lex had already noted down this suggestion while he was doing research, along with a few other things. Unfortunately, since the place they were going to was unexplored, there were only so many things Lex could prepare in advance. Any other advice he had to give would have to be as things developed. Luckily, he had his fancy monocle to help him out in case they encountered something they didn't know about, so he wasn't too worried. Ptolemy did not comment on whether he was satisfied with Lex's advice, nor did he let show what he really thought. He simply accepted what Lex said, but showed no indication of whether he planned on listening to Lex. Going through the procedure to teleport so many people took a couple of hours, but it was still nothing compared to TSA. "Brace yourself," a student advised Lex as they walked into the formation. Lex thought he knew what to expect, but the moment the teleportation formation activated, he knew he was wrong. His previous teleportations had hit him with a whiplash, but this time Lex felt like a sledgehammer smashed into his chest. Barely managing to keep himself from falling over, Lex managed to prevent embarrassing himself as soon as the expedition started. But he was not prepared for the chill that hit him next. He looked around and found himself in a small chamber, along with all the other students who were quickly putting on some sweaters and gloves. A moment later, he identified the sounds of an unabating gale. He looked out the window and saw what seemed like dunes of snow, and a snowstorm that threatened to freeze Lex to his very core. What was this? His research never said anything about snow. A moment later, he realized he hadn't packed anything thicker than a t-shirt. Chapter 247 I Can Be OP too. For a moment, Lex watched the raging snowstorm. He suffered flashbacks of being surrounded by millions of cultivator. But instead of fear of anxiety, Lex only felt curiosity. He had long since learned that much of the weather patterns in the crystal realm were dictated by ridiculously strong beings. For example, the way soul birds brought sunshine and warmth. He was convinced the snowstorm he experienced during his assessment was the result of that massive cultivator he saw at the end. Which caused him to wonder if the weather here was also a result of some massive snow creature. Considering this was an established city, they should have some defenses against creatures like that, right? But before he had an opportunity to sate his curiosity, he felt a look full of disdain fall onto him. He turned to see Ptolemy, fully dressed in winter clothing, watching him. Though his face was neutral, Lex was 100% sure he was internally mocking him. How could Lex serve as an advisor if he couldn't even manage his own wardrobe? This matter went farther than just needing a sweater, as normal cold would not influence Lex at all. But the cultivation world always added layers of complexity to everything. If Lex normally experienced temperatures such as 0 degrees Celsius without trouble, once the chill was enhanced by spirit energy, it was no longer a matter of simple temperature. It was the spirit energy itself that chilled him rather than the weather. The clothes everyone was donning surely had some protective functions to protect against such a spiritualized chill. One of the other students, who was on good terms with Lex, noticed the latter wasn't changing his clothes. Realizing he might have not brought anything to protect against such an environment, he offered Lex a spare. Perhaps if Lex wasn't suffering from the mocking gaze of Ptolemy, he would have simply accepted. That was the simpler solution. But he didn't want to give Ptolemy the satisfaction of knowing he was right and that Lex hadn't brought clothes. Instead, thanks, but weather like this doesn't mean much to me, Lex said with a smile. Lex wasn't just putting up a brave front. If there was one thing Lex had learnt during this 1 month at the academy, it was that he had seriously underestimated the worth of a SSS plus rank award. While his defense was steadily increasing, and now at level 5 Chi training, he could face most Chi training level cultivators without fear of being killed. It had not yet veered into the realm of overpowered. Instead, it was the immense ease with which he picked up any kind of defensive technique, and the ridiculous mastery he had over each one of those techniques that amazed him. He remembered once, during his job with the weaponsmith, she gave him a technique that would allow him to negate cold so that he could dip his hands into a liquid so cold it made liquid nitrogen look like fresh soup. Strictly speaking, it was not a defensive technique, since its actual purpose was to concentrate all the cold he would have felt on his hands to the tip of his fingers, which he could then channel into another object, forcefully dropping its temperature. It was an auxiliary technique used during crafting special equipment. But Regal Embrace begged to differ. To it, this was a technique designed to protect Lex from element-based damage, and so with a glance he learnt it. Even still, Lex did not realize the treasure trove he had until one day, while he was in the library, he encountered a section with various cultivation techniques. One could not learn those techniques at a whim, as not only did you need proper qualification, you actually needed to pay. Yet, so long as it was a defensive technique, just the introductory paragraph with a vague description of how it manipulated chi to give birth to various effects were enough for Lex to learn it. As if that wasn't enough, he even managed to learn the techniques that seemed to originate from completely different forms of cultivation. So, in this moment, when Lex was being assaulted by the passive effects of chilled spiritual energy, he activated one of the many techniques he had learnt, one of his favorites, actually. Immediately, Lex stopped feeling the chill and, in fact, felt a little warm, while an array character that represented ice appeared on the back of his right hand in a bluish-silver light. It was important to note that while the character that formed on his hand was used in arrays, the characters themselves were symbols born of the universe and represented its power. Even those who did not study arrays had some basic knowledge of such matters, and so, when the character appeared on his hand, and Lex moved around as if truly unaffected by the chill, some of the students who knew his role during this trip suddenly had a better impression of him. As an advisor, he did not need to be strong, but instead versatile. While he received a few acknowledging nods, he flashed a smug grin at Ptolemy. Sometimes, being petty felt good. The expedition leader snorted, but quickly turned his attention back to important matters. The presence of Frio birds complicates things a bit, but we have already planned for this as well. We'll be riding Delame lizards to cross the terrain and we'll have to get some hover coaches. Ptolemy did not bother giving everyone the briefing on what they had to do, only let them know that things were under control. It seemed that, even before Lex's suggestion, he had arranged for the lizards to be their mounts. As the expedition prepared themselves to move out despite the weather, Lex looked up into the sky. There were no giant monsters, and clouds covered the sky, but sometimes Lex felt like he vaguely saw the shape of birds. After asking what seemed to be common sense, he learned that Frio birds were the counterparts of soul birds. A Frio and soul bird each formed a couple, but they would only meet during mating season, which usually spelt disaster for the weather. Both these species of birds, while ridiculously strong, were not usually aggressive, as they did not feed on food to sustain themselves, only spiritual energy. Of course, if someone tried to provoke them, they would show that they were far from harmless. After exiting the teleportation hall, they made their way outside the city, where 120 saddled Delame lizards were waiting for them, with another 30 harnessed to several floating carriages. After loading most of their luggage into the carriages, and purchasing some supplies locally, they left immediately. Ptolemy had arranged for guides, so the poor visibility and the harsh weather did not seem to slow them down. Other than that, they had also employed some of the city's local guards as an escort, just to avoid any unnecessary problems. These were just some of the visible things Ptolemy had done, for Lex, who had been accompanying since they set off, saw for himself how he kept preemptively preparing for any trouble. As annoying as Lex found Ptolemy, he found himself learning a lot by following him. Maybe that was the real test, not to effectively advise, but to learn as much as possible. But, while Lex was having this epiphany, and was considering trying to mend their relationship, Ptolemy knew from the very start that he was not in need of any advice, but rather he was being used to groom this new and upcoming student, which is why he resented Lex even more. While Ptolemy himself worked to gain everything he had, the path was being carved for Lex even if he did not realize it. What neither of them knew was that the circumstances of their meeting had been carefully orchestrated behind the scenes by a certain department in the academy. They were not meant to be friends, but rather somewhat akin to rivals. Lex would learn from Ptolemy, while the latter was supposed to be egged on by the favor being shown to Lex and work even harder to prove himself. Currently, as things stood, they were playing along perfectly. Slowed down by the storm, they trod along for almost 12 hours before they reached their first campsite, which, as it turned out, had already been prepared long before their arrival. This camp was right outside the forest, and they would rest here until their path forward had been properly mapped by the forward team. Moving a small team through the forest might have been easy, but with so many people and carriages to take along, a proper path would be required, and it would take some time to plot such a path. Just as Lex was beginning to admire Ptolemy, and almost made up his mind to mend their relationship, the latter looked at him and said, "You sure you can keep yourself warm like that for long? It would be a shame if I need your advice, but I find my advisor frozen in a corner somewhere." Chapter 248 Invasion. Lex was suddenly struck by Ptolemy's sudden outburst. While it could not veer into the domain of an actual insult, up until this moment, the man had kept his disdain in check. He behaved professionally and did not let his personal feelings affect how he was supposed to behave. So then, why the sudden change? After a moment, Lex realized what had happened. Once they reached the first campsite, they were officially on their own, as even the escorts from the nearby city had begun to retreat. Now, Ptolemy was the true leader, and did not need to put up on a front. This did not spell well. But Lex was not one to back down so easily. "Even if I maintain this technique for 1,000 years, it won't tire me," he replied, as if he was talking about something mundane, like a crease on his shirt. But he had not lied. The only chi required on Lex's behalf to use this technique was the one required to activate it. Once activated, and the character on his hand formed, the technique would continue to run so long as there was ambient chilled spiritual energy, as it was that very energy that powered the technique. At a glance, this seemed like a very powerful technique which could make him immune to all cold elemental damage, but that was just a facade. Absorbing the cold was just the auxiliary purpose of this defensive technique, as its true purpose lay elsewhere. Therefore, while it could absorb the energy seemingly endlessly, such absorption was only focused on the ambient energy that passively surrounded Lex. In the case of an attack, this effect would not be able to absorb any of the energy, and the true purpose of the ability would be triggered. Although he had mastered this technique, it took a while for Lex to understand the concept behind this technique itself. This was because the definition of cold on Earth was the absence of heat. Since cold in itself was nothing except the relative distribution of heat, absorbing cold actually meant distributing heat away. Yet in an environment colder than his body temperature, the technique was absorbing the surrounding cold, therefore making him feel warm. Where was this warmth coming from? Eventually Lex understood. The heat was coming from the physics class he decided to drop in college. With that, he stopped thinking about it. His current focus was on Ptolemy, who was looking back at Lex with mild disgust. I think it's time we figure a few things out. To me, your aid is unnecessary and your presence is an irritation distraction at best. To you, this expedition is your passing grade. So, you can stick around, but stay out of my way and everything will go smoothly for the both of us. Stick to the middle of camp where you'll be safe, and treat this like a vacation and soon it'll all be over. Dismissed. Not bothering with Lex anymore, the man left. Lex, on the other hand, felt extremely aggravated, but at the same time, considering the circumstances, being ignored was the best thing that could have come from the situation. Had Ptolemy decided to do more dastardly things to express his discontent, life would have become very difficult for Lex. This still did not mean that Ptolemy wouldn't decide to take out his frustration on Lex again later, that was still a possibility, so Lex did not let down his guard. But, freed from responsibility, Lex could now spend more time learning arrays. Not to mention, there was another purpose this expedition happened to fill for Lex. Since they were soon going to enter unexplored lands, there was a possibility of Lex running into untapped energy sources. Although rare, it was not unheard of for an expedition to discover spirit stone mines, energy wells, natural formations and more wonderful things. In fact, searching for such things was a big part of every expedition. With nothing left to do, Lex returned to his tent to get some rest and chat with Mary. While things had not been all sunshine and rainbows, at least there hadn't been any major events at the inn to worry him, which was nice. In front of a Valon building, Midnight Inn. A small group of 6 aliens called Rascals appeared and immediately started looking around, assessing for any threats. They were wearing regular clothes, or so it seemed, for under their clothes they were all wearing skin-tight combat armor. Unlike in the old days, when Lex or one of his workers would greet new guests, personal holograms did that these days. These rascals received the standard welcome and explanation, but that did not diminish their wariness towards the inn. The rascals were an aggressive, war-prone race with limited intelligence. The upside to this was that, when trained, they followed their training dutifully without any extra thoughts, mostly because they had no extra thoughts. Not to mention, their intelligence had no detriment to their combat prowess, and so they served as excellent soldiers and scouts. These 4 feet tall, leathery aliens were humanoid, but had 4 arms, 2 facing forwards and 2 backwards, as well as retractable wings that had coiled on their backs. The closest thing on Earth that resembled these aliens were skin rats. But, just because they looked weird, did not mean they would be refused service. The 6 rascals exchanged looks, and then split up, each heading in a different direction. They had arrived here using golden keys provided by Jekyll, Heidi's father. Their preliminary purpose was to study the inn and gather as much information as possible, as well as anything on any forces that might be backing them, and the strength of their members. Jackal was a very vindictive man, but he was extremely useful for his organization, and so many of his desires were fulfilled. That did not, however, mean the organization would recklessly kill everyone the man wanted killed. They would at least do some background research first. They had no information about the Midnight Inn in their database, which dropped their evaluation of the inn by a lot. After all, if they were important, they would be known. Sending the rascals at this point was just a formality. A few hours later, when the rascals returned and submitted their report, the organization assessed it to be a lot of unverifiable claims. The staff that the rascals encountered were pathetically weak, and though there were rumors of the Innkeeper being a hegemon of the universe, it appeared that currently he was away from the inn. The organization determined it was nothing more than bolstering and bluffing, and deemed the Midnight Inn inconsequential. Of course, one flaw in their report was that they did not mention arriving at the inn via teleportation across space activated using a key. Since it was not mentioned, the organization assumed it was a place reached by more regular means, and one of the things that had intimidated so many others who visited the inn became overlooked. In the end, to satisfy Jekyll, an execution order was sent. A team of 500 rascals was organized, with the strongest few being in the nascent realm. The original team of 6 distributed enough keys for all of them, and then, the first ever invasion of the inn commenced. John clenched his fists as he kept himself from screaming out of frustration. He had come so ruddy close to finishing the mystery trial, but once again failed. The most frustrating thing was that this time, his failure was all his own fault. For the first time, he executed his own assassination plan without his system's help, and actually succeeded. He had stabbed the enemy in the neck, and the moment felt so great that he momentarily forgot that at higher levels, that was not enough to kill. The single moment he took to celebrate his victory was all his target needed to kill him in return. Just as he was writhing in bitter agony, 4 short guests appeared before him. He groaned internally, and just as he was about to put on a friendly face, they attacked him. The 2 nearest to him threw what looked like metal nets covered in spikes at him, while the 2 further back launched blow darts at his face. Before the attack even landed, they considered the man dead, for they could feel no cultivation from him. They were already looking for their next target when the 2 rascals holding the nets were yanked into the air. Grabbing the 2 metal nets with his hand, he pulled the enemies towards himself with no regard for the spikes. As the 2 rascals flew towards him, a simple backhand slap cracked their skulls and knocked them unconscious. He grinned at the remaining 2 rascals, his teeth conveniently holding the darts that shot at him. Then, as if they were candy, he sucked the darts into his mouth and started to chew. Fear and horror gripped the rascals as they realized they had encountered a formidable foe, a sharp contrast to the delight on John's face. He was just happy he had someone to vent on. After all, the innkeeper couldn't blame him for playing a little if the guests attacked him first, right? Chapter 249 4 seconds. Raphael was sitting in his wheelchair, sunbathing. Since he had woken up, he barely returned to Earth for a few days before returning to the inn. Not only was the inn safer, considering Earth's volatile political situation, it was better for his recovery as well. Not to mention, he had thoroughly confirmed that most of his information about the future in the near future was useless now. Only events further out in the future, or events unrelated to the situation on Earth itself, were still relevant. This meant he had to spend a lot of time figuring out what he needed to do. Just as his internal monologue was going on, 2 ugly, leathery rat monsters appeared in front of him. No, wait, that was insensitive. Rat aliens appeared in front of him. They took a look around to get an understanding of the situation, and then their sight landed on Raphael. As an experienced war veteran, he immediately recognized the look in their eyes, but instead of being alarmed, he raised an eyebrow in curiosity. Really? They were going to attack him? The answer was yes. The closest ugly, skinny, leathery rat monster immediately lunged at him with a frail-looking spear, aiming towards his skull. Given his current condition, there wasn't much he could do anyway, but Raphael did not as much as flinch as he watched the spear closing in on him with a smirk. From the initial distance of a few feet, the spear closed in on him in a flash. As it drew close, aiming somewhere towards the middle of his face, he even took the time to observe the craftsmanship of the spear. It was made of some kind of white material, and he could not tell if it was something synthetic or a kind of material he'd never seen before. It had green-colored lines running up and down its body, as if the odd material had some kind of disgusting veins sticking out of its body. Even as the spear was a few inches from his face, he did not move. Even as the squeaky battle cry of the rat monster hit him, his smirk did not disappear. The tip of the spear was but a few centimeters from his face. Then it hit him. That is, the gust of wind carried by the spear hit him, but the spear itself was held firmly in place by a vine that suddenly emerged from the ground. To be clear, the vine had wrapped itself not only around the spear, but the ugly, stinky, disgusting rat monster as well as its counterpart. For a moment everything was still, as the monsters tried to struggle within the vines, but could not. Then the vine pulled the 2 into the ground, the grass quickly covering up the area the vine had come from, as if nothing ever happened. Crystal Realm, Karam Forest, Lex's tent. Lex had been sitting on the ground, chatting with Mary about the inn and the Crystal Realm, when suddenly he received the loudest system notification to date. He did not need to go and check the notification because, for the first time, in a robotic yet disgruntled voice, the system directly read the notification out to him. Quest, Midnight Inn is being invaded. Ward off the invasion without allowing the guests to suffer harm. Quest time limit, immediately. Quest reward, gambler's coin. Quest failure punishment, reduction in authority. For a time that seemed to stretch to eternity, Lex was frozen as he suddenly panicked. This was exactly what he had been fearing. Not only was the inn under attack, he was far away and could not do anything. But Lex was not inexperienced anymore. He managed to recover from his panic and his mind went into overdrive. From the moment of the system's announcement, to him panicking, to his eventual recovery, exactly 1 second had passed. The system had given the quest before the rascals even appeared, but by the time Lex had recovered, they were already in the inn. Working faster than his mind had ever done before, he scanned the entire inn with his mind, identifying the various locations of the invaders. Whether it was fortunate or unfortunate, most of the invaders appeared in 3 different places. Most of them, around 300, appeared near the gate built into the boundary wall of the inn. This was a common place for new guests to appear, but as there was no attraction near it, it was fortunately empty of guests. The second place a lot of them appeared was on Main Street, near Avalon. Around 100 well-equipped rascals had just appeared, and unfortunately, it was a crowded spot. The third place they appeared in a large group was in front of Midnight Manor, a couple dozen or so of them. This place also had guests around, though not as many as Main Street. The remainder appeared in random locations throughout the inn. Once Lex understood their locations, he scanned them for their strengths. The strongest rascal's status was: name, K, 789465. Age, 110. Sex, male. Cultivation details, nascent realm middle. Species, rascal. Midnight and prestige level. Remarks: he's cannon fodder for the universe, and a boss for you. He immediately understood the division in power levels. 400 of them were at various levels in the foundation realm, 80 of them were in the golden core and 20 of them were in the nascent realm. This was an army that could decimate the inn. He didn't have any workers in those realms and the vine was only in the initial golden core realm. What could he do? If the husband and wife duo had managed to pass their tests by now, he could have used them, but currently they were both away, conducting their respective tests. There had to be a solution. Another second passed. He had to think of solutions fast, and he had to protect his guests and workers as well. He had over 4 million MP at his disposal, as well as 0.1% energy accumulated. If this wasn't enough to eradicate his enemies from the face of this universe, then as the innkeeper he should just retire. Lex's overworking mind suddenly entered a state of flow and he began doing multiple things at once. He immediately identified the rascals that were near guests and workers, other than the ones on Main Street. There were 12 such situations, including the ones near Raphael. Of these 12 situations, most guests were faced with foundation rascals, one guest was faced with a golden core rascal and the last one was Gerard and Velma, who faced a nascent realm rascal. Mary, control the vine and stop these rascal immediately. Lex said as he mentally sent her the image of the locations as well as the rascals that needed to be stopped. He was not aware if she would be able to multitask and control the vine in so many places at once, so he sent her images in decreasing order of urgency. The first image was of the rascal closest to harming someone, then one slightly further off and so forth. In the meantime, he spent 100,000 MP to create a teleportation circle on Main Street and teleported all the rascals away, directly to the front gate with the rest of the rascals. Unfortunately, this was not targeted teleportation, as he was able to do when he himself was at the inn, so anyone within was also teleported along, rascal or not. He quickly scanned the inn again, to understand what was the most pressing situation, expecting it to be Gerard and Velma but, beyond anything he could have expected, the situation was under control. In fact, the circumstances of those two and the rascal were so peculiar Lex actually lost 0.4 second in shock, despite the state of flow. But he moved on. The situation was far from handled, as a couple of fights had already broken out. Fortunately, the two fights involved John and Fenrir. He should have been worried for Fenrir, but in the single second he had not been observing the dog, it had already killed all the rascal near it. John, on the other hand, was eating darts? Not wasting any more time, he bought a formation for the sole purpose of trapping an army for 1.5 million MP and then started buying smaller, targeted teleportation circles to teleport his guests out of the formation one by one. Despite being smaller, each circle cost him 10,000 MP, but he couldn't be picky right now. Another second passed. By now John had taken care of his rascal and Raphael had been rescued. But some guests were still being attacked. Fortunately, a couple of the guests, being warriors themselves, didn't wait for a rescue and directly retaliated as soon as they were threatened. As another second passed, the most immediate threat had been handled, but the battle had not yet even begun. Chapter 250 Welcome to the Midnight Inn. Gerard was having a very good day. He was at the peak of the Chi training realm, and his bloodline had upgraded. A bloodline evolution was ridiculously difficult, because there was no set way to make a bloodline evolve and level up. Of the people who had bloodlines, most went their entire lives without upgrading their bloodline, regardless of what their cultivation level was. Of course, Gerard didn't know that. All he was concerned about was that, with the golf cart that Xeon had upgraded and his new bloodline, his rides would be a lot smoother. Furthermore, today was his day off, so he was spending time with his friend. How could he not be happy? How is Pamela doing? Has she recovered from the incident? He asked as he took a sip of hot chocolate from the finest china. She's fine, she's fine. She was over it in a couple of hours. These days though, she seems to be spending all of her free time at the gamer's den, Velma replied, a special gleam in her eyes. She loved to gossip, it gave her such a thrill. Since Helen had disappeared, she had lost her gossiping buddy, so now she rarely had an opportunity. It's good that the kids are getting along, replied Gerard, the worker who, himself, was only a few months old. Just as Velma was about to elaborate on the juicy gossip surrounding Pamela and Z, a rascal appeared in front of them. The duo had been having their chat in a picnic spot in the forest near the greenhouse, so that they could have their privacy. The appearance of a guest here, so far from all the main structures, was unusual, but not impossible. Despite being on a break, the duo prepared to greet the guest when the nascent launched a spirit attack on them. There was a devastating explosion and a smoke cloud filled the air while some of the surrounding trees fell over, now leaning against the trees that had not yet broken. The rascal had already looked past the two chi training insects and was sweeping the area with his spirit sense, his attention attracted towards a formation he discovered in the forest. "That was quite rude," said Gerard with a frown, as he dusted off his waistcoat with a frown. His right was still holding on to the cup, the hot chocolate in it without a single ripple. Behind him, Velma was disoriented and leaning against Gerard for support, her hair a mess but otherwise unharmed. The rascal was taken aback, but suddenly started sweeping the area with his spirit sense, trying to see the hidden expert that had protected the two. But, after a few seconds of searching, he found no one. "The assistant innkeeper has informed me that you are from a group of invader, and that we are understaffed at the moment, so I'll have to take care of you myself," Gerard spoke, as he put the teacup on the floor, his eyes starting to shine with a silver light as he did so. Gerard, like the other workers at the inn, was the proud owner of the Regalia Bloom bloodline. This was an incredibly powerful bloodline that came along with an immense cost. The bloodline allowed the user to take control of energy within a certain zone around himself. As for what kind of energy? Any energy that the user can perceive, whether it be gravitational, kinetic, heat, electromagnetic, chaos, primordial, spiritual, etc. They could then manipulate that energy to code any item or weapon of their choosing as a medium for that energy. It sounded straightforward, but it was anything but simple. An example would be that if Gerard stood in the epicenter of an explosion, he could channel all the heat, sound and kinetic energy produced into the thrusters of his new golf cart, and then use it to propel the cart, all without suffering any harm. Of course, there were limits to how much he could transfer, as each time he used the ability, he would suffer physical exhaustion, and his bloodline would also need to recover. So it was not like he could be dropped into a nuclear explosion, and then be expected to transfer all of that energy away from himself. Even if he had a dozen hot chocolates, he would eventually be physically exhausted to the point where he could not use the ability, and then the explosion would kill him. If, however, he had the physical capabilities of Marlowe, then it could not be a problem at all for him to channel the energy from a nuclear blast. But, no great power came without price. The Regalia Bloom was the same. In exchange for granting him access to all the energy in the universe, the bloodline altered his body, slowly and steadily, like a cancer that could not be treated. Yes, no matter how he tried to resist, Gerard was unable to avoid the price. The Regalia Bloom continued to work on his body, slowly making him irresistibly attractive. Do not underestimate the seriousness of this burden. This was not the kind of delicate beauty mentioned in novels that would make the MC fairer and more beautiful. No, this was an attraction that transcended space and time. Without actually changing his appearance, Gerard would slowly become beloved by any who saw him, regardless of their preferences or tastes. He originally underestimated the effects of the bloodline when he gathered a host of old ladies who only wanted to be chauffeured by him. Now, even countless middle-aged women expressed their love to him, unable to resist the sheen of his white hair. But how could he, a gentleman, tear up their families? The burden of their endless love was one he had barely learnt to tolerate. But, it was important to remember, all that was the effect and price of the Regalia Bloom bloodline before he upgraded it. Now though, as the silver shine in his eyes grew stronger, Gerard's body was lifted up into the air and he looked down at the rascal like a king, looking down at a peasant. "Don't you know it's against etiquette to strike a lady?" he said, his voice hitting the rascal like a shockwave, threatening to tear his eardrums. "Let me teach you some manners." Gerard's new and improved golf cart, which had been parked outside the forest, flew to him like a silver star shooting through the sky. Gerard carefully took off his blazer and put it down, just in time for the golf cart to appear, setting the blazer on the passenger seat as he himself took his place behind the wheel. Giving no time to the rascal to respond, the moving golf cart drifted through the air and smashed against the side of its body against him without so much as scratching the new paint job. The rascal was launched mercilessly through the forest, crashing through a series of trees. Even as the alien tried to stop itself using its spirit sense, the golf cart appeared again, this time smacking him in the face with one of the tires. Oh, and welcome to the Midnight Inn. Chapter 251 Precarious Situation. The rascal was smashed into the ground, forming a large crater with spiderweb cracks that spread across the forest floor. He was injured and a trail of blood flowed down from his lip, but that was the extent of his injury. It was not anger that filled the rascal's eyes, but discipline. He was a trained soldier, but more importantly, he did not have much room to think. In this disadvantaged situation, the only thing running through his brain was the training he received. He drew his weapon, a section staff with 4 chain staffs instead of the usual 3. Each one of his hands firmly held onto one of the sections. Letting out a battle cry, he attacked. Dashing up into the air, the rascal swung his staff furiously at the flying, shining golf cart in an attempt to squash it like a fly. Yet, instead of clashing, the staff gently patted the cart as all its energy had already been diverted. A green flame shot out of 2 exhausts at the back of the cart, before the cart seemed to jet out towards the flying alien. Yet, the cart was still in its original location. What flew towards the rascal was an attack in the image of the cart, followed closely by a few more. No longer underestimating the opponent, the rascal promptly dodged the raining golf carts and pulled back his staff. Holding the 2 ends of the staff, he started swinging it around himself like a jump rope, while his 2 free hands pulled out a slingshot and took aim at Gerard. It did not matter if his attacks were useful or not, the rascal was not able to think so far ahead. All it knew was to attack, and so it did. Launching endless projectiles at the cart, the rascal also moved closer to smash the cart with his staff that he was constantly swinging. Even if Gerard absorbed some energy from it, the alien was providing energy constantly. And yet, it seemed to make no difference. Like a swan gliding across a lake, the golf cart moved around the forest, easily dodging the attacks. Realizing his attacks up until had now failed, a seriousness entered Gerard's eyes as a silver, shining clutch and gear appeared beside him. Wiping off the first bead of sweat he had ever experienced in his entire life, Gerard revved the cart. He was far from done. Near the forest, 4 rascals were searching for enemies. Since they had appeared in an isolated area, Lex had yet to teleport them into the formation because they were not a priority and he was too busy taking care of non-stop emergencies. Suddenly, they heard a familiar battle cry coming from the forest, and immediately turned that way. The battle cry was actually a signal of a tough fight and a call for reinforcements. Since their aid was needed, they would respond, for that was how they had been trained. They began jogging towards their goal, pulling out their weapons as they did. Z was at the edge of his seat, watching an anime called Sasuke, doing his best to hold back his tears. The start of the show was so emotional, and he could really feel the protagonist's pain, while cursing the antagonist of the show, Sakura, with all his heart. But then, suddenly, everything changed. One moment he was in the gamer's den, the next moment he was at the front gate of the inn. Before he could even begin to feel confused about what had just happened, the assistant innkeeper sent him, as well as all the other workers, a message telling them that they were being invaded. Still amped up by all the emotions he had been feeling, and filled with frustration and hate, he immediately turned on his battle music and let loose a war cry. Instead of a single card, all 52 cards from his deck started flying in the surrounding air, before they flew directly into the army of rascals. This time, he did not use the flat of the cards, and used their sharp edges to cut through the enemy horde. He was visualizing all the enemies from every anime he had ever seen, and did not forget to yell the name of his attack while he was at it. "Is this your card jutsu?" But, as spirited as Z was, unlike Gerard, he was neither at the peak of chi training nor had his bloodline evolved. Let alone killing, even hurting the Foundation Realm rascals was a difficult task for him. Fortunately, even as his cards swept through the enemy ranks, and the surrounding guests were starting to realize something unusual was happening, he was not the only staff member there. Doe, the rarely seen worker who was John's assistant, along with Pamela, were up on their feet and quickly bringing the guests to a corner away from the fighting that had abruptly erupted. Gerard's fellow chauffeurs were also doing their best at separating the enemies and the guests, even as Lex began teleporting them away one by one. The caretakers and staff from Avalon were doing their parts as well. On one side, Harry was frozen in fear, unable to fight because he was just a normal human until recently, not. He was standing still because he was using his sorcery and literally burning the souls of any rascals that dared near him. He was born and bred in New York. Something as mundane as a fight to the death could not faze him at all. But, even with all their help, as well as the hundreds of vines that started to emerge from the ground to attack the rascals, the inn staff was but a single strong attack from the nascents away from being destroyed. So far, the only reason the strongest of the rascals hadn't attacked yet was because, according to their training, they had to let their subordinates test out the enemy's strength first. They would wait 2 whole minutes before attacking, unlike what they would have done if they were alone, in which case they would have attacked immediately. The Golden Core rascals would attack after 1 minute. While these intervals were short, they were enough to analyze the enemy's battle strength. Fortunately for the inn, this is where their lack of intellect played in. The strategy they employed was for direct or pitched battles, and not a surprise raid, in which case they should have used their strongest attacks first. This gave the inn staff, Mary and Lex enough time to respond. While Lex was still teleporting his guests away, managing to move several each second, Mary was not resting either. She was controlling the vines, yes, but she was also doing something else equally important. John had not even begun to torture, to interrogate his attacks when she appeared right before him. "John, the inn is under attack. I need you to go to the front gate and help out," she said in a commanding tone. John, however, was not too keen on it. Not that he didn't want to help, but that he would rather not get involved with anyone with the guts to attack this inn, whether they were misguided or not. He was even more reluctant to fight since his cultivation was actually sealed, and while he had a tough body, in actuality, he was not a body cultivator. Not to mention, he was not an actual official and staff member as he had never used the platinum key, so technically, it was none of his business. Finally, while the innkeeper was mysterious and powerful, he could tell this assistant was nothing more than a hologram. She did not intimidate him. "Assistant innkeeper, I don't mean to be rude, but you probably know that my cultivation is actually sealed. Although it may not seem like it, I am not really able to fight." Mary, who had been about to leave, froze. She turned and gave John a look that spelled death. John was not deterred, and just as he was waiting for her to threaten him or something, he heard a sound that he never would have expected. It was the familiar ping of his system. New quest, eliminate invaders. Quest time limit, 5 minutes. Quest reward, Jericho puzzle piece. Quest failure punishment, permanent drop in cultivation by 1 major realm. Remarks, a good assassin needs to be able to eliminate armies. John was not only startled, he was aghast. This was not the kind of quests his system usually gave him, and he had never encountered a case punishment before. But more than that, he dreaded a single thought that was roaming in his mind. "But, despite my inability, as a part of the inn, I will do my best to protect it," he quickly said, and bolted towards the inn's gates. 5 minutes was not a lot of time. He absolutely could not suffer such a disability as letting his cultivation drop. To be fair, he had gained all his cultivation through the system, so it made sense that it could also take it away. Still, it was not something he wanted to experience. Especially since, in the back of his mind, he could not stop imagining the death stare Mary gave him moments before his quest popped up. Could she have? No, it was impossible, he thought to himself, but his grimace only worsened. Chapter 252 Punishment. From the moment the rascals entered the inn to Mary telling John to fight, roughly 40 seconds had passed. In this time, Lex had teleported nearly 100 guests away and coordinated with Mary to have her attack certain areas with the delinquent viper vine. With the immediate threat to most guests and his staff gone, Lex started going through his various new permissions to see the best way to resolve the situation. Back in his tent, Lex had gone pale and his entire body was drenched in sweat. His mental exertion had gone beyond anything he had ever experienced before. Between constantly scanning the inn, coordinating, teleporting and ensuring everyone's security, in these few seconds, he had already done hundreds of tasks, and he was not done yet. The quicker he found a solution, the better, so now all his focus was on searching for an answer. Gerard was already panting and his hands were trembling, but his grip on the steering wheel never loosened. Even now, he had not suffered a single attack, but he was showing signs of exhaustion. After all, regardless of how powerful his bloodline was, he was facing an enemy 3 major realms higher than himself. But, despite his severe disadvantage, surprisingly, the rascal was in a worse condition. He was not bleeding or hurt, but his leathery skin was pressing against his bones as if he was malnourished. The frequency of his attacks had dropped, and he had stopped flying, deciding instead to stand on the ground. There was no time for hesitation, so Gerard sped his cart towards the rascal in an attempt to ram it once again. Suddenly, as if out of thin air, a massive ball of flame appeared in Gerard's path, threatening to crash into him, but just as it touched the cart, it seemed to vanish, as if siphoned into the cart itself. The 4 rascals that had worked together to set up the ambush were dumbstruck, as that attack should have worked. The next thing they saw was 2 jet blue flames erupting from behind the cart as it smashed into the nascent rascal, once again launching him into a crater. Gerard was not surprised at the presence of the additional enemies, for he had identified them as soon as they started using their techniques. He was, however, concerned about facing more foes. Velma, fortunately, had already retreated somewhere, so at least he didn't need to worry about her. It wasn't that she didn't want to help, but that she was too weak compared to these enemies to make a meaningful difference. Quite sure that he hadn't managed to deal significant damage to the first rascal, Gerard instead turned his attention to the other 4 that had just arrived. 2 of them were in the Golden Core, and 2 of them were in the Foundation realm. They, at least, shouldn't be as much of a challenge. Gerard reversed the cart without looking back and swiftly made a turn, changing the direction of the cart to face where the rascals had been hidden amongst the tree branches. Not giving them any time to evade, he promptly launched the long-range attack that traveled forth in the shape of the cart. The two golden core rascals managed to evade, barely, but the two foundation ones were hit dead on, blowing up their bodies in the process. An attack hit the golf cart from behind, as the nascent realm rascal climbed out of the crater, but it was impossible to surprise Gerard as he was aware of all changes in the surrounding energy. Like all the others before, this attack vanished, and the energy from it was channeled into another attack that Gerard launched towards the other golden core experts. At this point, despite his best efforts, Gerard was having a tough time keeping his eyes open. It might be a good time to retreat. Oh dear, you rascals really know how to make a mess, the galactic sovereign turtle said, as it walked through the woods. Somewhere behind it stood Velma and the gardener. Velma was looking at Gerard with worry and concern, while the gardener, well, he was crying over the trunk of a broken tree. His art, it seemed, would never see the light of day. It seems some punishment is in order, it said, once it got a clear view of all the destruction. What happened next will shock you. No, what happened next was very anticlimactic. The grass on the ground started growing around the rascals, tying them up. They tried to resist, but whether it was brute strength or a complicated spiritual attack, the grass seemed impervious. The nascent rascal was especially concerned because it discovered that not only was the grass trapping its body, it was also trapping its soul. In such a dangerous situation, with no alternative, it decided to use the final ultimate attack it had been trained to carry out, the destruction of his core. As soon as it activated the technique, nothing happened. Like a mummy wrapped in grass instead of cloth, the last rascal fell over as Little Blue flew over to pick them up one by one. Seeing the situation resolved, Gerard finally relaxed his grip on the steering wheel and nearly fell out, but Velma quickly appeared to help him. They turned to thank the turtle, but it had already moved on, dragging the weeping gardener behind it. As for the rascals, back in the day, Lex had made an interrogation room near the greenhouse where Little Blue went and deposited the still struggling rascals. There were already a few in the room, neatly stacked in a corner. For the first minute of the fight, the inn staff managed to hold their own against the small army of rascals. But, as the second minute started, they immediately fell into a disadvantaged situation. After all, on one side was a trained army and on the other side were waiters and waitresses. More than Z, who had caused a lot of the rascals to nearly bleed out, Harry proved to be the man of the hour. Dozens of bodies lay on the ground around him. They were not dead, and in fact, seemed the exact picture of health, as they were still at their physical peak. It was their souls that had been badly damaged. Harry didn't even need to try to kill anyone, as at lower levels, even the mildest of damage to the soul left one nearly crippled and unable to move. Whether they were Foundation experts or Golden Core ones, just an altered version of the spell he used to cut hair left them with cuts all over their souls. Even if they managed to avoid being crippled, the pain was enough to leave them powerless. Yet despite his success, he was no longer actively attacking enemies. Now he was focused on defending the inn staff. The golf carts, unfortunately, had been destroyed and a lot of the staff were injured to various degrees. On this battlefield, only 3 warriors from the inn remained in relatively good condition. One was Harry, of course, while another was Z, and the last was one of the lifeguards from the lake called Todd. Standing at 6 feet 8 inches with a body sculpted as if the after and a before and after collage, Todd had activated his Regalia Bloom bloodline mid-battle, and used it on his surfboard to smash enemies like beavers in a carnival game. With the combined efforts of the 3, they had managed to barely hold off the enemies, but no one knew how long it would last. Then, just as the song on Z's speaker changed, and the first chords of 7 Nation Arm Wrestlers played, John fell from the sky right in front of the 3. He did not waste any time in talking and immediately started a massacre, his speed only increasing the deeper he went into the enemy lines, not slowing down. Out of everyone here, he seemed the most anxious to resolve this battle. This was because, while his cultivation was sealed, as he had achieved the Earth Immortal realm, his body had gone through a transformation to immortality. Compared to these lower-leveled cultivators, his body seemed like an unrelenting force of nature. As someone who had benefited from such an advantage, it made perfect sense that he was determined to complete his quest, otherwise his cultivation would fall back down to the nascent realm. His skills as an assassin were finally put on full display, and even unarmed, he was like a scythe cutting down grass. For a moment, it seemed like the tide had turned, but then the strongest few of the rascal army decided to change their plans. According to their training, when fighting an enemy much stronger than themselves, they should focus on causing as much collateral damage as possible. Following that logic, they gave up on observing the fight and all ran in different directions, determined to kill as many people as they could manage before John got to them. Chapter 253 Lex, the Harbinger of Loopholes. Chapter 253 Lex, the Harbinger of Loopholes. In his tent, Lex was completely drenched in sweat. His shirt was stuck to the skin and his eyes were squeezed shut because he could not continuously wipe them. Right now, it was only due to his flow state that he was not panicking. No matter what his authority, the inn never provided him with a single direct way of defending itself. There were a few very specific defensive formations he could buy, but he had neither the MP nor the energy to power them. Every few seconds he would scan the inn to ensure everything was not deteriorating into a mess and, fortunately, things had taken a positive turn. John had joined the fight and was rampaging amidst the enemy army. If only he could buy guards similar to that who could just fight alongside him, but the inn prevented him from doing that. The only way he could buy anyone with any fighting ability. Eureka! Lex literally yelled out as his mind quickly moved to implement his idea. 20 nascent rascals invaded the inn. Of those, one had fought Gerard and one was currently exploring the Midnight Mountain, unaware of what else was happening, and the remaining 18 were on the battlefield. When they decided to split, all 18 moved at the same time. 3 of them decided to target John, to hold his attention and distract him from what the rest were doing. Of the remaining 15, 2 decided to attack the inn's staff for the same purpose, while the remainder tried to escape the formation. The speed of a nascent cultivator was one that was near impossible to keep up with under normal circumstances, and their attacks were only faster. Z and Todd sensed a massive surge in some kind of energy, and immediately tried to divert it all, but not only were they limited in how much energy they could divert at a time, the attack was too fast. They only saw a bright light, and before they could understand what was happening, they were blown away, crashing into those they had been trying so hard to save. Harry similarly had sensed a surge in soul energy, and immediately attacked it. His attack had slowed down the other nascent soul rascal attacking them, but could not stop it. The rascal didn't even need to attack Harry, he fainted from exhaustion on his own. The battle, which had so far been a concert of yelling and clashing weapons, had been blanketed by a shocking silence, followed by endless explosions. John was an assassin, not a frontal fighter, so the 3 rascals that went after him were more than enough to trouble him. He had dodged a dozen sudden attacks without any chance of retaliating. The rascals, who knew they were ultimately the weaker ones, continued to use long-range area of effect attacks, resulting in dozens of explosions that, ironically, did more damage to other rascals than anyone else. It was a split second, and the tide of the battle had drastically shifted. The worker who was holding on to Z's bloodied and unconscious body had only just recognized what, or rather who, he was holding when their assailants flashed in front of them. The workers could not even respond. They only looked at the four-armed, leathery alien like the harbinger of death. The rascal did not waste any time and gathered a shining white energy in its arms to attack when a shadow fell over its body. Surprised, it looked around to see for any incoming attackers when a giant, ivory foot crushed him into the ground. The other nascent rascal, who had seen the giant appear out of thin air, tried to retreat. Unfortunately for it, the giant's size did not diminish its speed in any way, and before the rascal could move but a few feet, the giant kicked it, breaking dozens of bones and incapacitating it. The appearance of the giant caused a huge disturbance, as almost everyone turned to look at it as neither the rascals nor the workers had seen it before. But, after the initial shock, many immediately realized that the giant strongly resembled the faceless training dummies in the training room. But while the other training dummies had been made of wood and did not do much other than attack physically, this one seemed to be made of ivory and actually used various techniques. The ivory giant did not wait around to observe or give his opponents any time to react. It identified its next target and rushed, breaking the sound barrier as it did so, before seriously damaging each one of its targets. The dummy did not kill any of the rascals, its sole purpose was training after all. Instead, it helped them train their willpower by leaving them with broken bodies and extreme pain. Just as drastically and quickly as the battle had begun, it ended, and the dummy left the formation to pursue the remaining few rascals. Except that no one clapped or wooed as the crowds usually did after a tournament. They were still in shock. "What are you just standing round for?" Mary asked, as she appeared in front of the workers. "Take all the injured to the recovery room, quickly. The danger has ended." She quickly started organizing those that were uninjured or less hurt and, after giving one look to the ruined landscape of the inn and a kneeling, panting John, turned to her duties. The rascals were not killed, and if left alone, they could cause more of a mess. Fortunately, Lex let her know that the galactic sovereign turtle was on the way, and that he would take care of imprisoning the rascals and fixing the damage from the battle. She had to focus on only a few things now. First, she had to make sure no one died by immediately sending them to the recovery room. Second, she had to apologize to all the guests who were caught up in this mess and give them all a 1-week free stay at the inn, as instructed by Lex. Of course, it wasn't really free as he could pay for their stay. Thirdly, and perhaps, most importantly, it was her job to oversee the interrogation of the rascals and find out exactly why they had come and what was their goal. They needed to know if more enemies would be on the way. The only suspects Lex had at the moment were the pirates who visited every so often, just because of the nature of their work. But that didn't make sense. She needed to find out if there was any lingering danger. Lex collapsed onto the ground, his state of flow immediately breaking once the situation at the inn was resolved. Although the system did not let him directly by any kind of defensive measures, he had once again found a loophole. He upgraded the training room even more than he previously had the greenhouse, spending 500,000 MP on the upgrades alone. Then he spent another 250,000 MP on this massive, incredibly powered training dummy that could reach the peak of the nascent realm in strength. This was of course the theoretical peak of the nascent realm, and also took in mind species much stronger than the rascals as well, which is why it would be able to easily defeat them. But, technically the training dummies shouldn't have been able to leave the training room, however once upgraded, the room had more features. Not every kind of training can be done in a secure environment, and not every technique can be carried out alone. This is why the training room allowed for the training to be conducted in any environment within the inn, and could target not just one person, but entire groups. Using a massive amount of MP and his remaining energy, he bought and powered this massive training dummy, while registering the entire invading army for training sessions for near-death harm and threats. This was a method Lex would be able to replicate in the future should he be invaded again, but this massive dummy would need him to absorb extra energy to run. This was not to mention that, now that he was once again down to 0% energy, the system's operations were once again compromised and it was running on metaphorical energy-saving mode. While Lex lay on the ground panting like he had just run a marathon, his mind still recovering from the extreme exertion it had just experienced, 2 thin wooden roots emerged from the ground behind him. At first, they froze once they left the ground, as if to see whether they would be detected. But, after a few seconds, when Lex didn't show any reaction, they slowly continued to pull out of the ground silently, and stealthily moved towards Lex's neck. The 2 roots slithered in the air, as if snakes, slowly approaching helpless prey, and only took a few moments before reaching Lex. Too tired, and too caught up with the invasion at the inn, Lex was completely unprepared when the roots wrapped around his neck. Chapter 254 Bro. Chapter 254 Bro. Lex was so mentally drained that at first, he didn't even notice the increased pressure around his neck. But when his head actually moved a little because of one of the roots, he promptly realized someone was giving him a massage. Alarmed, he jolted up and turned around to see 2 roots bending upwards, as if someone was holding up their hands to explain they meant no harm. What the? Lex murmured while he tried to make sense of the situation. Broseph, Brobert, Brosellini, relax. You're so stressed. It's totally killing my peaceful vibe. The voice seemed to be coming from the roots. Lex saw no mouth and no one else, so it could only be that. Are you a Trollope? Lex asked, suddenly remembering something from one of his classes. Trollops were one of the main 7 races of this realm, but the information about them seemed to be vague. What he could firmly conclude, however, was that they were some kind of sentient plants. Bro, of course I'm a Trollope. The name's Karam, nice to meet you. I must say, the negative vibes you've been giving off got me shook, bro. You need to relax. It doesn't suit your aura. Karam, like the forest? The forest is named after you. Bro, why you gotta do me like that? If you must use my full legal name, it is Karam Alejandro Forest III. I am the forest bro, it's not named after me. Well, I'm the forest up until the deadfall cliff. After that is my cousin, Goalie Malevolent Forest. Don't let his fresh maple appearance fool you, that bro is a racist. He don't deal with no one other than Trollops. Lex was once again confused, but he tried to let go of his normal precepts about living beings, since he was in a new realm now. This was a forest full of hundreds of different species of plants and probably hundreds of thousands of trees. Yet Karam claimed to be the whole forest itself. How was that possible? But, it seemed that it wasn't that the definitions of Trollops that were vague in his class, just that he was unable to comprehend them properly. Well, it's nice to meet you too, Lex finally replied, getting a handle on the situation. In the future, you shouldn't wrap your roots around someone's neck without asking, it can be considered rude. Bro, can you blame me? You're the one that lay down on my roots. If anything, that was rude. But it's fine, I get it, you humans are weird. I keep telling that other human as well that Goalie won't like it if you pass through him, but he's adamant. Well, it's no bark off my trunk what you guys do. Say bro, you wearing some cologne or something on your back? It smells really nice. No cologne, Lex replied briefly as he sat back down on the ground. The surprise of having roots around his neck gave him a boost of adrenaline, but now that the situation had calmed down, Lex was once again reminded that he was tired. Furthermore, he suspected that nice smell that Karam was referring to was from the lotus on his back. There would be no way Lex would share any information about that. Just another 500,000 years and the lotus would give him a 5-star world. Damn bro, that sucks, the roots replied as they slumped, looking disappointed. I was hoping to use a cologne to impress some meadows. My mom's been on my case about getting a girlfriend. It's true what they say, even when you move out of your parents' forest, they never stop trying to control you. She says if I don't get a girlfriend on my own, she'll set me up with a swamp. Swamps are too clingy bro, trust me, you don't want to get with a swamp. Is that the reason you came to me? To ask about the cologne? Lex was a little protective when it came to matters of the lotus, predictably, and this was the first time anyone had shown any indication of sensing the lotus. Partially. You smell nice, so it won't be a problem for you to get along with most trollops. Not Gully though, so don't even bother trying. Lex nodded and continued, this other human you're talking to. His name wouldn't be Ptolemy, would it? Yes bro, Ptolemy. He reached out to me a few weeks ago, and we cut a deal. I'll be moving the trees out of his way until Deadfall Cliff, and in exchange, he brought me some very rare seeds for my forest. Bro, once I'm done renovating, you won't recognize me anymore. On some level, Lex had to admire how well prepared Ptolemy was for this expedition. In that case, he should take a page from Ptolemy's book and start making his own preparations. Hey Karam, since you can cover a much larger area than me, I have a question for you. Do you know about any spirit stone mines or large reservoirs of energy nearby? Many bro, and they're all underground. But, I can't tell you bro because I need them. But, I don't mind telling you of a few in Gully's territory. If he had to move away, I would be so happy, bro. He's so annoying. Unexpectedly, just like that, Lex learnt the location of several spirit stone mines. If their expedition could uncover even one it would be considered a success, which is why Lex knew that it shouldn't have been so easy learning about them. He spent the rest of the day chatting with Karam, asking him indirect questions to learn more about trollops. He refused to believe that there wasn't more to it, and that a living being could be something that should be a part of the landscape. It was too strange. When he went out for dinner, Karam did not follow as he was not used to talking in front of too many humans. When Lex left his tent, he was surprised to see how much the area surrounding the camp had changed. The trees had started moving out of the way on their own, and as if that wasn't enough, they were using their roots to stamp down the ground where they moved from to create an even and level road. He could see the relatively straight road leading deep into the forest, but some moving or shuffling of trees in the distance made it clear that the path wasn't complete yet. After dinner, when he returned to his tent, Karam was missing, which Lex was completely fine with. He scanned the inn once, to make sure everything was in order, before he went to sleep. He needed rest, for tomorrow the expedition would once again start moving. Mary stood silently in the interrogation room near the greenhouse, her expression frosty. A part of her, admittedly, was slightly upset that they weren't able to properly interrogate the rascals. This was because the sovereign turtle had done something to them that turned them into mindless puppets. Since she hadn't seen him do anything, she wasn't sure exactly what he had done. Regardless, the result was that the rascals would answer any question that was asked obediently. What she learnt was, truly frustrating. The rascals had no idea what organization they worked for, simply because they had never been curious about it. In a way, they were the perfect soldiers because they could not retain any valuable information to leak. They did not know the reason for the attack, nor did they know if there would be any follow-up. All they could share was that their objective was to destroy the inn, plain and simple. She resisted the urge to rub her forehead as she thought of the problems that lay ahead. Let alone the fact that Z and Todd were injured, and that they would have to remain in their respective RPs for the night. They had no effective measure against any subsequent attacks. Whoever attacked should not give up so easily, and if that were the case, they would need to prepare. If there was any bright side to all this mess, it was that the turtle was planning on using all the dead rascals as fertilizer, and was thus very satisfied. They should help speed up the delinquent vine's growth, or so she was told. Just as she was struggling with indecision about what to do, she noticed something wonderful. The lich, Anita, had completed her trial and had officially become a member of the inn staff. A wide grin painted her face. Lex had told her about Anita's strength, and it would definitely come in handy should they suffer another attack. Quickly, new plans started to form in her mind as she decided to get to know Anita a little better. This way, when Lex woke up, she would at least have something to present. Chapter 255 Don't Do Me Like That. Chapter 255 Don't Do Me Like That. After a much-needed rest, Lex woke up to the sound of shuffling and moving. At first, he didn't pay much attention to it as he yawned and tried to summon the energy to get up. But then, all of a sudden, it occurred to him that the sound was way too close. He jolted up to find a small clump of humanoid shape of leaves munching through some of the dry rations from Lex's backpack. "Hey bro, you finally exited from your hibernation. I was getting bored." "Karam?" Lex asked as he looked at his ransacked backpack. The small leaf man came up to Lex's was it, and the facial features looked oddly similar to his own. "Of course, bro, who else could so easily enter your tent? Do you have any idea the kind of wards that Ptolemy guy has around this camp? If you don't, well, neither do I. But damn, were they a pain to bypass. I doubt anyone else could do it so easily. Anyway, I have like a serious proposition for you," Karam said as he shoved another protein bar in his leafy mouth. "Those are my emergency rations you're snacking on," Lex said as he looked through his backpack and checked to see if anything was missing. "Come on bro, don't be like that. I'll drop you some fruit before you leave, it's not a problem at all. Let's focus on the important stuff. My proposition. If you accept, I'll pay you half up front, and half on completion. What do you say?" Lex did not reply immediately, and took a moment to deliberate. While Lex was still in the dark about various customs and basic common knowledge of this realm, his classes had enlightened him somewhat about how humans perceived and interacted with the other races. Understanding that, while all 7 races had a similar level of intelligence, because of their inherent physiology, each race perceived the world around them and their relationships differently, was the absolute foundation of the human race's foreign policy. In a situation where Lex was in the dark about many things, following the broad stance human leadership took towards the various races should somewhat keep him protected. Trollops were the only plant-based race of the 7 major ones, and like the rest, they had their own territory. But, unlike the rest, they were also widely spread across the regions for the rest of the races, as they usually had good relations with all races, for they had strong influence over plants which could aid any race, not just the main 7. But this did not mean that their population was huge. Quite the contrary, they were probably the race with the smallest population. Anyway, all of that was unnecessary information for Lex. What his focus was on were the major trade deals of the Hum nation with the Trollops, which usually had to deal with food, mostly. After going through all the information he had received in his political relations class, he suddenly realized how important that class would come to be if he stayed here long term. "First, tell me what your proposal is." "Yeses bro. I knew I could count on you." Karam fist pumped, as if the deal was already done. "It's quite simple, really. My roots have been getting a little stiff lately, and I need to expand my territory a bit, or I won't really be able to reach adulthood. I was just musing about where to spread my forest, you know I have neighbors on all sides. It's the humans on one, my cousin Goli on another, some really, really hot dudes in the radiation wasteland, and then my Auntie Gina. Now bro, trust me when I say, ain't no one got the acorns to mess with Auntie Gina bro. And bro, I really want to hang in the wasteland, but since I haven't reached adulthood yet, it's bad for my complexion. I have a really good thing going with the humans, so that just leaves my cousin Goli." The Trollop paused, and threw another protein bar in his mouth, then continued. "Now, I remember you asking me about some spirit mines, and I told you about some in my cousin's territory. But how will you ever get to them? Bro, not to look down on you, but they're at least a dozen miles below ground." Lex did not answer, for technically even he didn't have an answer. He had hoped that maybe he'd be able to buy something from the system gift shop the way he kept on buying Botlamdu, but with 0% energy, currently he couldn't even buy that. Karam continued, "Which is where my proposal comes in. I'll help you find a way to get to those mines, and you." Out from the ground a root came out, holding a bag full of acorns, and handed them to Lex, and Karam explained the deal he wanted. Just as Lex had suspected, Karam wanted Lex's help to take over parts of his cousin's forest. "Won't that hurt your cousin though?" Lex asked, out of curiosity. "Bro, it's no hard feelings, bro, it's a strategic acquisition of property of declining value, bro. Yeah man, I know big words too. I once attended human business school as a potted plant for the class, I know all about assets and stuff. If anything, Goli will appreciate my help. After all, I doubt you'd just leave those spirit stone mines alone after finding them. Once they disappear, the fertility of the land will quickly decline. In human terminology, that healthy part of Goli's body will quickly turn into cancer." "In that case, why do you want it?" Lex asked, curious. He did not comment on Karam's suspicions about what Lex would do to the spirit stones. Strictly speaking, by taking those mines for himself instead of declaring them, Lex was committing a crime. But, by helping Karam expand his territory of control without letting anyone know about it was also not something easily shrugged off. Both of them had a vested interest in keeping their deal secret, and such a mutual threat would force them to be good allies. Don't do me like that, bro. Have some faith, I have my own plans. Karam shared more of his proposition, and in the end, considering Lex's dire need for energy, Lex said yes. This first half of Karam's payment was the method to reach the crystal mines in Goli's territory. Lex stuffed his acorns, as well as his payment and the fruit he delivered, into his backpack and finally exited the tent. Now that he had a plan to get some energy, Lex felt much better, and he could finally focus on other stuff. One major part of making a positive impression on a group of new people is to constantly reaffirm it. He had to go socialize with the rest of the expedition while they were still at camp, because it would be too difficult once they started moving. After a hearty breakfast that he shared with the group of meteorologists, and gaining some basic understanding of the kind of weather he could expect coming up, he started going around camp and spending some time with various groups. It was easy to spot Lex. He was the only one amongst heavily clothed people to wear a half-sleeve shirt. The character of ice on his hand was giving off a gentle sheen, but it only continued to absorb all the cold energy. Some of the members of the expedition thought it was a unique tattoo, and he didn't bother to correct them. Finally, after lunch, Ptolemy called for a group meeting and explained the next part of the expedition. They would leave shortly, and their next camp would be at Deadfall Cliffs, the border for human exploration. He explained their goals for the expedition once again, though everyone was quite familiar with them, the safety measures that would be needed and what kind of cooperation he expected from everyone. Lex couldn't help but notice that he never mentioned Karam or his cousin Goli. He had understood enough of Ptolemy by now to know that the man must have made some preparations to face the upcoming hostile Trollope, and Lex was curious. It did not hurt Lex's ego to admit that he found it quite insightful to study how Ptolemy operated. But, since the other person had clearly drawn a metaphorical line in the sand between them, if Lex were to go up and ask him now, he would stir up the possibility of trouble. After a moment's consideration, he decided to go ask, anyway. Of course, he wouldn't directly ask him the question. If there was anything Lex learnt from being the innkeeper, it was to hold the power and authority in a conversation. If Lex asked him the question, he would directly be putting himself in the weaker position from the start of the conversation, and there was the chance Ptolemy wouldn't answer. He had a much better strategy to get his answer. After the meeting, he went and waited by Ptolemy's tent until the latter arrived. Lex gave him an amused look, as if he was watching a performance, before saying, "I noticed you didn't tell anyone about the upcoming dangers of a hostile Trollope. Not a bad plan, no need to cause unnecessary panic. After all, since you don't need my help, I'm sure you have your own plan for how to deal with an entire forest that hates humans." Chapter 256 Odyssey. Ptolemy didn't show any visible reaction to Lex's goading, but he was internally surprised by Lex's comments. Information about the Trollopes was not exactly roadside knowledge, and to a certain degree, it was even kept hidden. This was because Trollopes more often than not played a significant role in food production. The human population was not small, with it being quite common for counties to have several billion humans. Even as organized as the Hum nation was, arranging for food at such a scale was a massive undertaking. In the scenario they were facing, there were a few neighboring Trollopes, with Karam being one of the weakest, and hence the most cooperative. Unfortunately, right after Karam's territory was that of another, extremely hostile and very aggressive Trollope. That Trollope alone was the reason why humans stopped expanding in this direction. Of course, that didn't mean that this Trollope was so strong that humans couldn't fight it at all, but that high-leveled cultivators didn't usually take care of things like these. Not only did they have their own duties, the Hum nation felt strongly against the idea of becoming used to having others take care of all your problems. While it was true that higher-leveled cultivators could take care of everything, first of all, they were not omnipotent and couldn't be everywhere all the time. Secondly, if they did everything, then what would the lower-leveled cultivators' contribution be? They were not living in some utopia. Humans needed to become used to the habit of facing trials and dangers to achieve what they want, instead of having someone hand it to them. Ptolemy was going through various thoughts in his head, but the few moments of silence that created gave Lex the impression that he was ignoring him. In that case, some more goading would be required. Or is it possible you hadn't thought so far ahead? If you need help, I don't mind giving you some advice. After all, I wouldn't want to affect the safety of those in the expedition over a little spat. The situation is handled, Ptolemy replied, his voice full of vinegar. If you must know, the guards of the expedition have been fully informed of all the upcoming threats and have made ample preparations. Dealing with a Trollope is not too hard, for at the end of the day, they are just plants. As hostile as they may be, the threat of a forest fire will put them in their place. After that, Ptolemy did not bother explaining further and went inside his tent. He honestly didn't even want to explain this much to Lex, but he couldn't have him going around telling the expedition that they were heading to certain death. As the leader, he needed to provide some assurances, even to the members of the expedition he didn't like. Such was the burden of a leader. Lex didn't push him any further. The answer was fairly simple, but he doubted that Ptolemy's preparation was lacking. Still, it was interesting to know that sometimes he did not need to search for complicated solutions to everything. Lex returned to his tent and packed up his stuff. Since this was their first camp, and was built even before they arrived, it would stay here even after they left. Ptolemy had hired a small group of guards to maintain this camp for their return journey, but that was for later. For now, everyone got on their Delame lizards and started wading through the snow that had accumulated on their newly built road. Since the Frio birds still seemed to be nearby, the weather had not changed at all, and the endless snowstorm raged on. One might wonder how the expedition was able to see and navigate during such a relentless storm. The answer was that the fresh, falling snow produced in this storm gave off an ethereal, silverish light that made the whole world look like it was in a fairy tale. Its beauty was like moonlight but on steroids. As long as one had a sleeping mask for the hours they were resting, no one would complain about it. So, while they made their way through the forest on the relatively straight and level road, Lex finally had the time to divert his attention to the inn. Things at the inn were, well, they were great, considering the circumstances. The invasion had naturally affected the inn's reputation a bit, and some of the guests had stopped visiting as the inn no longer seemed as safe as before, at least until the innkeeper returned. However, that number was still low. Furthermore, despite the invasion ending over a day ago, another one had not happened. Considering that they still did not know the identity of the attacker and their true motives, this was a grand sign. Last, but not least, after having been abruptly exposed to a life-and-death situation, Fenrir's growth had undergone an explosion. Currently, he was the same size as the galactic sovereign turtle, meaning he was much bigger than Lex. Moreover, while his cultivation growth was the same, he had unlocked various abilities from his bloodline. One of them was the ability to change his appearance, though size was still not an option. This had helped him tremendously, as, by sheer coincidence, one of the slimes Fenrir had befriended back on X-142 was teleported to the inn through a golden door. Fortunately, Fenrir was not alone at the time, and as soon as he recognized the slime and was about to greet it, he was stopped. Then Mary explained to Fenrir that it could not expose its identity and, unexpectedly, the dog understood and complied. Lex wiped some metaphorical sweat off his brow, as he completely forgot about the whole identity issue when he summoned Fenrir to X-142 with him. He would have to be more careful in the future. His giant training dummy had assumed the role of a statue beside Midnight Mountain, since there really wasn't any energy to control it. Fortunately, people were used to the inn changing all the time, so no one questioned it. His staff was recovering nicely, and surprisingly, none of them seemed to have any mental trauma about going through such an incident. In fact, many of them seemed to consider it normal. That made Lex realize that he had seriously underestimated his workers, and especially the ones that had unlocked their bloodlines. The fact that Gerard was able to hold his own against a nascent-level rascal while in the Chi realm, he did not think such an ability could be easily replicated, even in the vast universe. He decided to emphasize their cultivation and training some more. If all of them became powerhouses similar to Gerard, would he need to be worried? He further reduced their work hours and added mandatory training and cultivation time to their routines. Furthermore, despite Gerard's reluctance, Lex upgraded him to head of security. If there was any consolation, it was that Lex allowed him to keep the golf cart. Furthermore, he told Mary to approach the drake that had upgraded the cart, and see if it was willing to work for the inn. Of course, actual hiring would have to wait for now, but there was no harm in testing the water. Which finally led to their newest hire, Anita the Lich. While due to her amazing cultivation prowess, she was an important member of the inn, Lex's real purpose in hiring her was actually very different. Once Lex's tumor was removed, he finally became aware of the real weight of what it meant to be a cultivator, as well as the innkeeper. He had no intentions of being mundane whatsoever, which meant that he had the expectation of reaching a very high cultivation realm. Along with such a cultivation came a long lifespan. He had already seen many of his guests who had lived for thousands of years, let alone Anita herself, who had lived for a ridiculously long time. Currently, his experience made it impossible for Lex to imagine what living for so long would be like, but he understood the importance of history and recording it. So, among the many other things Lex had planned, Anita's first and most important role was to record the history of the inn. He told Mary to have her interview all the workers and start recording a detailed account of all the events that happened within the inn itself. This history would be highly classified, for now, and Lex had an idea for he would make it accessible in the future, but that would have to wait till he had spare energy to use. Once she was done with recording the history of the inn, he told Mary to have her start recording the histories of the planets that were connected to the inn, one by one. This seemed like a tedious and endless task, one with no seeming purpose or reward, but not only did Lex have a plan on how to use all this, Anita herself, as a person who had once created history, had a strong interest in learning and recording history. As someone who had first-hand experienced how the events of her time were changed from memories to stories, to legends, to myths, she was endlessly intrigued by learning other myths, and trying to figure out the stories that had inspired them. It seemed that coming to the inn was the correct decision, at least for her. And so, it was with this giddy enthusiasm that Antia began recording what would one day be known as the Odyssey of the Innkeeper. Chapter 257 Sinister Intentions. The ride from the camp to Deadfall Cliff was long and monotonous. It was difficult to talk to those around you unless you were in a carriage or sharing the lizard with another person, for you would end up having to yell over the blowing wind. For most, this was a boring part of the trip that was necessary, but for Lex it gave him much-needed time to catch up on what was happening at the inn. After he was done distributing tasks and making important decisions, he spent some time just catching up. Unfortunately, Mary could not spy on guests' conversations the way Lex could when he was at the inn, so he had no idea how Earth was doing these days. Had the political instability finally calmed down, or were there new issues now? Had the Jotun Empire finally reclaimed all of the Vegas planets, or was the war still ongoing? How was the harvest back on X-142 doing? How was Nibiru progressing? Lex quite enjoyed knowing about his guests, but it seemed all of that would have to wait till later. Eventually, when he ran out of things to check up on even at the inn, Lex decided to use the time to continue reading the book in his ring on arrays. He would have preferred to cultivate, but that wasn't something you could easily do while riding a traveling lizard. They traveled continuously much longer than a day, but fortunately, the physique of everyone on the trip could handle such exertion without issue. When they finally arrived at their destination, it was abruptly made clear by the drastic change in scenery. A steep and sudden cliff appeared, marking the end of the forest, as well as the border of human exploration. Hundreds of feet down below was a forest of orangish-yellow maple trees, the leaves moving gently in the wind as if welcoming everyone down below. Even the weather across the cliff was different, as there seemed to be an invisible dividing line that prevented the snowstorm from extending past the cliff, instead replaced by the warm breeze of early summer. Yet, as welcoming and picturesque as it seemed, no one was fooled. There was a reason this was called Deadfall Cliff. As cheesy as the name was naturally picked up when few, if any, ever returned after venturing past the invisible border. It was the exact place they were going, and was the place where Lex's true trial would finally begin. Ptolemy did not waste time on any needless ceremony. After ensuring everyone was arranged into proper formation, with the 30 student soldiers making up the outermost layer of their expedition while the rest formed a close circle within. Then, after ensuring everyone was seated securely on their lizards, they ventured forth into the warm abyss, their lizards climbing down the cliffside as easily as they walked through Karam Forest. Despite the confident demeanor of Ptolemy and their protectors, Lex could not help but tighten his grip on his lizard's leash as he felt a silent tension fill the air. As the temperature around him changed, going from cold to suddenly warm, the array character on his right hand stopped glowing, though it did not disappear. Karam Forest had been frigid cold, yet safe and secure. Goli Forest was warm and inviting, but his instincts warned him of a sinister evil. It was not fear that filled him, but wariness. None in this expedition were untested and unaware, for beneath their casual banter and smiling faces, each and every person here was born in times of chaos. It was not just the external threat of an unbeatable enemy that tempered them, but the knowledge that they would be abandoned by their own race if they did not prove to be useful. It wasn't that there were none in this realm that procrastinated, or were lazy. It was that those who did were already dead. Still, while they had skill and strength, making light of the danger ahead was a mistake none made. It was their experienced caution that created a mood Lex mistook for tension. Instead, what he would soon come to realize was, it was their anticipation for whoever dared to bar their way. After all that build-up, their descent was uneventful. As soon as they reached the bottom, Ptolemy sent out scouts to check for nearby threats, as well as to locate a place to establish their new camp. Before wading into danger, they needed to create a secure base of operations. In a way, staying beside the cliff was both very dangerous and the most secure. This was because, if they built their camp in the forest, they would have to deal with a hostile Trolop. Lex did not fully understand how dangerous Trolops were, but he was not looking forward to fighting a forest. But, if they stayed by the cliff, then they would literally have their backs against a wall should they come under attack. The situation was bad either way, so it depended more on how they responded. A short, tension-filled wait later, the scouts returned, stating that there were no signs of any dangerous predators nearby. But, at the same time, there was no source of running water in the vicinity either. Even though they were cultivators, a source of fresh water would be important for any long-term base, not only for their consumption but for other uses as well. Of course, they could use water affinity spiritual techniques to artificially create water for themselves, but this was not a good solution as it would exhaust their cultivators' energy. So, as much as Ptolemy wanted to build a base near the cliff, the party eventually moved into the forest. Their speed was much slower now since the trees had not cleared a path for them and the carriages with their luggage needed to maneuver around them. Initially, everything seemed to be going fine. But, after a certain amount of time, unknowingly, Lex started to feel a certain anxiety growing in his chest. Moving the carriages was taking too long. The expedition party, while trying to stay close, somehow still ended up being divided into clumps. The weather had gone from warm to hot, humid and sticky. The sound of the lizards walking through the grass was too loud. Suddenly, it struck Lex. The sound of the walking lizards was too loud. The forest, as warm and welcoming as it seemed, was instead too quiet. The bright orange leaves were too prominent. Immediately, without even realizing what he was doing, Lex lifted his hand from the heavy Harley attached to his waist and put it on his sword, before prompting his lizard to move up to Ptolemy. The man was not happy to see him, but the seriousness in Lex's eyes caused him to hesitate from insulting him. But, at the end of the day, no matter how strong Lex's instincts were and how accurate his premonition, his level was just too low. By the time his instincts had warned him, it was already too late. Before Lex could even speak, chaos erupted. Chapter 258 Able to challenge the heavens. On a battlefield of giants, every step they take would be like an earthquake to the mortals living down below. Their battle cry would be the sonic boom that threatened to tear the eardrums of lesser beings, each of their clashes a biblical Armageddon for those suffering the misfortune of being nearby. So when Lex, a mere chi-training cultivator, was caught in the middle of an ambush, with flaming, razor-sharp leaves slicing through the air threatening to cut the world in half, and batons of tree branches beat down on them to crush their backs, it was a testament to regal embrace that he remained unharmed. One moment he was looking Ptolemy in the eyes, about to warn him about danger, the next moment his pupils constricted when he saw the canopy alight with flames. The array character for ice on his hand shone with a silverish blue light, and an armor made of ice suddenly covered not only Lex, but his lizard as well. The raining bullets made of leaves could not melt his armor, for unbeknownst even to Lex himself, the ice was that of the Frio birds themselves. But, while he was saved from the temperature, he doubted he would be safe from the branches that came crashing down on him. After such a long time of riding Fenrir, Lex was long accustomed to controlling his mount effortlessly, and so it was with finesse undeserving of its race that the lizard dodged all attacks. He had been saved from the rising temperature, and avoided the direct clashes, but there was nothing that could protect him from the shockwaves that traveled through the air. The weakest of these attacks was in the Golden Core realm, while most were in the nascent realm. How could Lex expect to survive such shockwaves traveling through his body? The answer was with a straight back, eyes full of unyielding determination and a will to challenge the heavens. Also, he still had the talisman to protect him from nascent-level attacks that automatically turned on when he was threatened. So, when death rained down on the expedition and the forest tried to beat them like drums, the weakest of the expedition, Lex, was the most unhurt. But though they had been taken by surprise, if a simple, extremely lethal ambush was all it took to eliminate the students of the academy, then as the holy land of the human race, its reputation was undeserved. The moment Lex's armor had appeared, Ptolemy already reacted and launched a counterattack. Unlike the orange flames produced by the forest, Ptolemy produced green flames that spread around as if he was someone who vaped, competing with a smoke machine. The green flames consumed the orange ones, and clashed as if the two were solid entities. Around them, while the other students did not respond as fast, many of them were able to quickly retaliate. Especially the 30 students trained as soldiers. Lex could not understand exactly what they had done, because he was busy trying not to die, but they all looked very cool whenever he saw them. The fight was not short, but for Lex it only involved controlling his lizard to stay out of everyone's way. An hour later, or maybe it was several hours later, the fight ended just as abruptly as it had begun. While initially they had been surrounded by a dense forest, they now appeared to be in a burnt-down clearing. As Lex saw green flames spreading in the distance, eating at the trees, Lex suddenly understood what Ptolemy meant when he said he threatened a forest fire. Maybe Goli would not be afraid of normal flames, as it appeared Goli himself was adept at controlling fire, but the green, malevolent flames produced by Ptolemy was anything but normal. Suddenly, the armor around Lex receded, and the character on his right hand reformed, although much dimmer now. While Lex was analyzing their situation, suddenly it occurred to him that the whole expedition was staring at him. Over a 100 soot-covered, bruised and beaten students looked at the neat and clean Lex, seated comfortably upon his uninjured noble lizard. It was like a scene out of a story and, unbeknownst to Lex, the few members of the expedition who had heard rumors about him, suddenly recalled the latest one. It was said that even immortal cravens could not injure a hair from his head, and though he had been born from that family, he had forsaken his family name so that any prestige he built, it would be of his own design. Reverence flashed in a few eyes, before it quickly disappeared. They were still in danger, and now was not the time to dwell on such things. Ptolemy did a quick check, and though there were a dozen injured, no one had died. No longer bothering to be gentle, the expedition bulldozed through the forest to the campsite one of the scouts had picked for them and immediately began laying down defense. For the first time, Lex saw formation masters at work as they erected protective formations around their new campsite. Others chopped down all nearby trees, while others still used their techniques to level the ground. In a few hours, the expedition managed to monopolize a sizable pond with fresh running water from multiple small streams, put up formation-reinforced wooden fences and built watchtowers. The efficiency with which they worked was only matched by the nonchalance of the students. None of them were at all bothered by the ambush, and even the injured had conveniently taken sedatives and gone to sleep so as to accelerate their healing process. Lex was only just beginning to comprehend the mentality of humans who had been raised knowing they would die at war when one of the watchtowers sounded an alarm. Their camp, which they had not even finished setting up, was facing its first attack already. As if that wasn't enough, the enemy this time even managed to scare Lex. It was snakes. Tens of thousands of snakes. Chapter 259. The expedition begins. The battle that followed left Lex unusually flustered. Their camp's defenses, despite only having just been built, seemed impenetrable, which meant there was no actual threat to Lex. But at the same time, he couldn't just relax or focus on something else, because if the defenses fell short, he would need to protect himself. He couldn't participate in repelling the attack because, frankly, he was too weak to make a meaningful contribution. He couldn't even watch the fight because if he came too close, he would make himself vulnerable to shockwaves from the battle, and might even get in the way of his allies. In the end, he spent multiple hours just waiting for something to happen. In the end, the battle ended with their camp managing to defend successfully. Ptolemy, afterwards, went into the forest with a few guards, and though he did not say what he did, assured the camp there would be no of such more attacks once he returned. With his assurance began the true purpose of the expedition. This entire region was unmapped, with little to no knowledge of anything. Cartographers built themselves their own watchtower, from where they used telescopes and other devices to map out the surrounding terrain, as well as try to figure out the best direction for their expedition to proceed. Others started studying the snake's physiology, as they were the first living things they had encountered other than the trees. Speaking of which, from mingling with the various small groups, Lex learned that these were not actually maple trees, but an as of yet unknown species of trees, the bark of which was extremely resistant to flame while the leaves themselves were very flammable. They had already begun studying the sap and the roots of the trees they had cut down, and were proposing new uses for them. Others were studying the soil and mineral composition while other groups still were studying the currents of spiritual energy in the area. The camp had truly come alive, which brought a lot of emphasis on the fact that Lex had nothing to do. Well, officially he had nothing to do, since Ptolemy could not be bothered with him. Unofficially, though, Lex had a lot to do. This expedition had only just begun, and would likely continue for months if not years, but Lex only had a limited time with them as he was just undergoing a trial. That meant, in the next few weeks, Lex had to get access to at least one of the buried spirit stone mines without alerting anyone. The trouble was, Karam had not given him a map of their location, rather, he had only told Lex key or identifying features of the area nearby. To help Karam fulfill his own agenda as well, he had provided Lex a way of escaping Goli's supervision as well, but that did nothing for hiding Lex from the beasts. Over the next few days, small hunting and exploration parties would venture out from the camp several times a day, and Lex would accompany at least one such party every day. He had proven capable of ensuring his own security, so no one really minded, not to mention that everyone more or less knew that Lex was supposed to have a say in their defenses, so just accepted this as a part of his duty. Furthermore, even on the trips that Lex did not venture out on, he made sure to interview the scouts or guards that went out so he could develop a deeper understanding of the terrain, as well as the habits of the fauna of the region. He corroborated all of his analysis with the zoologists in the expedition so that he could be sure instead of forming baseless speculations. What Lex was actually doing was creating his own map, and formulating his own plan for how he would get the spirit stones. To the people of the expedition, however, it seemed like Lex was taking his job very seriously, and was working hard to ensure they suffered no more unexpected attacks. Some people had noticed how, even before their first ambush, Lex seemed to have sensed some danger and tried to warn Ptolemy about it. The extra attention, of course, was due to the rumors about him. Cut off from society, the only thing the people from the expedition had to do during their free time was gossip. Of course, there were many more people being gossiped about as well, with Ptolemy being a key figure. However, it was exactly because rumors of Lex were mixed in with so many other stories that people actually forgot that they were supposed to be just rumors, instead of facts. Of course, none of that had anything to do with Lex. After a week of scouting and research, he was prepared to venture out of the camp alone to properly begin looking for the mines. There was just one problem. "Why are you going out alone?" asked the student who was watching the gate. It wasn't an interrogation, since they all somewhat knew one another now, but he still had to ask. "To do some personal reconnaissance. There are some places it's much easier to scout alone." "Are you sure? Not that I mean to doubt you or anything, but, if you run into trouble, you might have a hard time surviving on your own." "Not to worry, I have taken adequate precautions. Still, I think I need to let Ptolemy know about this, just to be safe." "Sure," Lex replied, letting out an exhausted sigh. Considering that they were living in such close quarters, Lex did not expect to be able to hide the fact that he was going out alone from anyone. He was just hoping for more of an apology instead of permission approach. He didn't relish having to explain his actions to Ptolemy. Ptolemy, likewise, was not happy about the fact that Lex had been so active. If Lex had just been a lazy, entitled brat, it would have better fit his internal narrative about him just being someone who was handed everything instead of earning it. Even though he knew he should have looked into how Lex was able to detect the ambush before him, his existing bias had prevented him from doing so. His strategy for dealing with Lex had been out of sight, out of mind. But when the latter was literally taking the initiative to contribute by scouting on his own, it was entirely impossible to ignore him. "You're not a scout, and we have no scouting missions that require going alone. What exactly do you want to do? We don't have the manpower to waste on a rescue mission if you get yourself in trouble." "Then don't," Lex replied, rolling his eyes. "I thought you didn't care what I did as long as I didn't get in your way. And I'm literally getting out of your way, so why do you even care?" "Do whatever," Ptolemy replied. "Just remember, I'm not going to waste any manpower on saving you if you disappear." Lex was relieved that Ptolemy wasn't going to try to stop him from leaving, but it also increased the pressure on him as well, knowing there would be no fallback or rescue should things go wrong. Chapter 263. Chapter 263. The crunch of stepping on dead leaves on the ground was unusually audible as Lex stepped out of the camp alone for the first time. While normally he would have admired the satisfaction of such a crisp sound, this time Lex could only worry about the fact that he was not trained to move silently through a forest, or without leaving a trail. But there was no room for self-doubt on this journey through a sentient forest, stuck in a realm that was not his own, without so much as a GPS or even a compass for that matter. No, there was no kind of hand-holding going on. The only way Lex would ever get back was if he took the steps and risks necessary. Anyway, who needed a GPS when he had the fancy monocle? Fitting the monocle in front of his left eye, Lex quickly departed. Since Lex did not have the skill to hide his trail, he had decided to actually submit a scouting report when he returned, to make his venture more credible. With the monocle feeding him information, he was bound to learn more than the expedition members, anyway. Lex moved at a light jog for 15 minutes until he was on the border of the camp's radius of influence. He didn't know what Ptolemy had done, but Goli hadn't attacked the camp after the first day, and most animals had vacated the area. That did not mean the danger was eliminated, but at least they weren't being targeted in the same way. Lex took out an acorn from his backpack and crushed it in his fist before covering himself with acorn dust. This acorn provided by Karam would allow Lex to hide from Goli's senses and eliminate much of the danger for him. But, moving forward, he would still need to be more careful. The best he could do to stay hidden was move close to trees and crouch between the tall grass or behind random bushes. That would in no way hide his figure, nor would it prevent the sound of his footsteps on crunchy leaves. Fortunately, things were not as bad as he made them seem, as he had gotten somewhat used to moving through the forest while he accompanied previous scouting parties. He was currently following a stream of water, hoping to find its source. One of the mines nearest to him was deep underneath a lake, Karam had told him, but no one had as of yet found one. It was hard to tell how much time passed in the forest, as there was no concept of the sun rising or declining in this realm. Instead, the leaves seemed to always emit a warm, incandescent yellow light that made it seem like the forest was stuck in perpetually at noon. At least that made it easier for Lex to identify any creatures in his path. Up ahead, he saw a small scaly creature that looked somewhat like a grasshopper, only about 3 feet wide, drinking water from the stream. Not wanting to take any chances, Lex moved around the creature, as he had done so many times before, when the monocle showed him something interesting. It identified gold. Hidden behind a few bushes was a naturally formed tunnel that seemed to descend underground at a 30-degree angle. Right at the mouth of the tunnel, however, was a small rock with bits of gold in it. Having worked with the weaponsmith for so long, Lex learned an interesting tidbit that he suspected fed the actual reason for the value of gold back on Earth. It was a great conductor for spiritual energy, and when mixed with other metals in the manufacturing of weapons, or any item really, it served to enhance its capabilities greatly. Could this be a gold mine? Lex put the gold-infused rock in his backpack and decided to carefully explore the tunnel. The immediately dark tunnel was a sharp contrast to the ever-bright forest, but while it troubled Lex, the monocle was in no way impeded from functioning. As Lex slowly descended, the monocle started to detect other valuable ores and minerals. Lex was congratulating himself on making a huge discovery when the monocle flashed a familiar red sign stating danger. Thankfully, the danger was not in the usual bold letters that meant Lex was about to be attacked. Up ahead in the cave, hidden in the darkness, was some kind of creature, asleep thankfully, that the monocle did not have any information on in its repository. But, while it could not identify the creature, it gave Lex plenty of information on it. It was massive, with the length of its body at 20 feet, 6.1 meters, nearly a dozen short and fat legs, 2 scythe-like claws and a face that seemed to exist directly on its torso. Its body was not scaly or lethargy, but instead consisted of an unusual blend of metals and minerals. Whatever it was, it weighed a few tons and Lex thought that the metals that made up its body were extremely valuable. Deciding not to take any more risks, Lex silently exited the cave and grabbed a few more rocks on the way out. Lex spent another few hours searching for any identifying landmark that could help him locate one of the mines he was looking for, but when he could not, he decided it was safe to share the story about the tunnel with the camp. With this, if the tunnel proved to be valuable, their attention would be focused here, making it easier for Lex to explore other places in the forest. Once he returned to the camp, much to the relief of the student on gate duty, Lex first went to someone called Barry and told him about the tunnel and showed him the rocks he had brought out. Barry was a sort of jack-of-all-trades kind of guy, and had deep knowledge of geology, metallurgy, energetics, thermodynamics and a bunch of other fields Lex did not know the meaning of. Initially, Barry was listening with interest, but as soon as Lex began to describe the creature he jumped off his seat and yelled, "Druck! You found a druck lair? Rich! We're going to be rich! Quick, someone called Ptolemy. Tell him we're going to be rich." Lex was startled and confused at Barry, who was laughing like a maniac. "Barry, what the hell is a druck and why are we going to be rich?" "Drucks are creatures that live in spirit well, Lex. If we can confirm the presence of a spirit well, then the Academy itself will reward us for this discovery." Suddenly, Lex felt like cursing Karam from the bottom of his heart.